This is episode 6 of Narrative Wake, your favourite talk show that you don't know the reason for the name of. Still not going to reveal that. Still going to keep teasing you. Going to keep referencing it annoyingly. A bit like how someone in those, like, previously on this show, sometimes they reference stuff, if you notice, that doesn't actually, like, happen in the episode because they want to just tease that plot line and keep you remembering, you know. So at some point we'll reveal what it is. So anyway, as everyone should probably know now, including all children and adults, this show is sponsored by Esports Pools. Now, back in the day, if we had opinions on games or we thought someone was going to win who was an underdog, we just had to tweet about it from behind aliases. And sometimes, if you're a real coward, you didn't even put a picture of yourself. You would just put some sort of an icon, perhaps an animal, a bird, perhaps. And you would just spew out all your hatred and all the problems in your life and the depression and all that stuff. But through the medium of minutely analysing a video game tournament, primarily held in Europe. And you would just do that, and you would tell everyone, see, I told you that team would win. I knew he is better than you said. But you could never actually get any sort of tangible result from that, except all the messages of people saying, like, fuck off, no one cares about EU LCS. They're not going to do well at Worlds. TSM, 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 kill yourself. Like, that's all you used to get that was tangible. You never could get, like, money, for example. Like, you know, literally the lifeblood of our society. You know, you can exchange it for goods and services. You can do a lot with money. So if you wanted to win that money, you can actually, if you think you know it all, just go on Esports Pools and bet. You can literally bet on the games. You can make a fantasy team. You can construct the team of players you think is actually good, you know. And I'm not even going to say if it's like good or bad, because you can pick TSM players and since they win, they actually would do well in fantasy, you know. Obviously, they wouldn't do as well as Jensen. So you'll have to balance out whether or not you actually want to win the fantasy contest by picking Bjergsen, or you want to pick like Jensen and then... Oh no, you'd lose rather if you pick Bjergsen, or you pick Jensen, and even though you think he's just a KDA player, that would actually make you win the contest because he would have superior points. And so on the metrics we actually currently have within our systems, life is sort of telling you he's better. But listen, if I know any of the fans out there, and I do, I don't think that life telling you something or repeated, you know, like tangible results telling you you're not succeeding will stop any of you. So carry on as you were. Now then, episode 6 of Narrative Wake. I hope I said 6 at the beginning, not 5, but doesn't matter. Keeping going. I'm the host, Thorin. Long-time closet TSM fan, because we all know that the only way you could ever have an opinion that is different to a TSM fan's is if you are secretly jealous of TSM. Now, I just want to put this out there. That exists in the same universe as a world in which lots of TSM fans have distant opinions to me and criticise me. So if we were to apply their razor of logic, I'll leave them. I'll let them figure out if they know what that meant. So usual co-host, Kelsey Moser, who you will have noticed is no longer at the, you know, in a barn in Europe, if there's always like a set of stairs, like a little ladder, and you go up and there's always a little room up there. Like she used to live in one of those. That's where she did all the past episodes. So you probably thought like you know, oh, the lighting's probably a bit off, you know, the shadows and that. Now she's in a perfectly lit, like a very almost sort of sterile room, like some sort of like a, you know, someone who lived in like an upper middle class family in upper state New York might have, you know, perfectly lit room. She is that white. Now, I realize in the modern political climate of identity politics, she is actually to blame for everything, but no, just her opinions. Please, for the sake of this show and for me personally, just only blame her for her opinions. Because, by the way, there'll be a lot to blame. So we'll keep moving around the box. In the lower right-hand corner is Deficio, who you might notice by his Twitter tag on the overlay, Riot Deficio. So, oh yeah, I'm getting Riot casters in this motherfucker. So listen, keep fucking around with me. I'll get Jat in here one day. And won't that be a fucking glorious day? I mean, I teased Freak before. I said I might have Freak one time. But the difference is, if I had Freak on, I would actually be quite polite. You know, I'd actually legitimately... Here's the thing. Here's a little secret for people. I actually want the shows to be good. So, for example, if I had Freak on, we wouldn't just, like, wreck him and just bring up all stupid stuff. What we'd do is I'd actually try and get him to sort of talk at length about the game in a way that he doesn't in the current formats that he does stuff, you know. Try and get him to bring him into our world a bit, but then see what he thought, you know, and see if he was indeed a man of the people. So, speaking of men of the people, Deficio here is... He's actually, a lot of people don't know this, he's actually the equivalent of people like Froggen, Perks, etc. Because, you know, if you're a top talent in Europe, obviously, every split, you get offers from NA, you get offers from other regions, you know. You can go and you can play for a lot more money, or be a caster and get a lot more money, get a lot more fame, get a lot more fans. But certain people, like Froggen, up till the end of Season 5, they actually turn those opportunities down. You know, they say to themselves, well, first of all, they say, you know, I'd rather get to Worlds, definitely. So, you know, if you have to go and compete against those NA talents and players, you know, you might not make it to Worlds, you know. They've got a kind of a stacked deck there, fan favourites. So you might not make it anyway. But also, yeah, you'll get paid more, but you won't have that same integrity in your heart, you know, of knowing that you stuck in the region that you actually care about. You know, one that actually has vaguely good League of Legends, at least. And even though it'll be to a smaller group of fans, it'll be fans who aren't, how would you say it, cretins. You know, people, they can have different opinions. They can come from different countries. They can think anything they want. But they won't sort of just say 3 letters and think that's like a discussion. You know, they'll actually have to say things like, well, I think Fnatic's not that good for this reason. They don't just say TSM. You know, there's sort of a preoccupation in this intro. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're picking up a theme, anyone. Anyway, so nice to have you here, Deficio. Obviously, the original Toxic European player, who in his first ever sort of famous interview just said fuck Bjergsen. Now listen, I've said fuck TSM players many times myself, you know, but you were actually a friend of us at the time, you know, you were trying to be a mentor figure. You were trying to be the person he wanted to be one day. You were the older brother, and that's how you taught him to grow up. Is it any wonder our solo queue is filled with ragers, is filled with top players from Greece that have 95% report rates and think that typing XA, XA, XA makes up for all the bad things they have otherwise said beforehand? I think ultimately it's your fault, Deficio, I have to say. Anything to say for yourself?
Yeah, I guess I'll take the blame for that one, but
okay.
It was a friendly gesture. I just worded it wrong because my English wasn't very good.
And all I'm going to say is this. You think of a lot of the toxic players that Europe's produced. There's a fucking lot of Danish ones, but that's all I'm telling you. There's a lot of Danes out there. They make up a heavy group. So, final person in the overlay. I alluded to him in the intro. I don't know if any of you realised that wasn't actually as vague as I made it sound. It's pretty targeted, you know. A lot of the stuff was even basically only applied to him. So it's Veteran, who in many ways is the archetypal Twitter analyst. You know, he is the guy who did dissect every draft, and I will give him credit, though. Here's the credit I won't give other people, is that he actually was ahead of the game in as much as for a brief period, he did attempt to actually do content which was along these lines. Like, if he had a controversial opinion, such as that Odoamne was a better top laner than Huni, then he would actually make it into content. I know someone else in this overlay also is also one of those perverts who twists logic to believe that someone who in his own team is considered low econ and not focal priority could therefore be the best player at that role. Even that sort of, you know, you kind of just check moving the goalposts as and when you please there to make him the star carry, you know, because objectively couldn't be the carry, even in his own team. So you're another one of those people. But as I said, I'm very tolerant of other opinions, even ones that are wrong. And I like to just let people say their piece. And you did actually do some pretty good pieces back in there. I will give you credit. You did a couple that were pretty good, because this is actually a key point for new content creators. Even though they were opinions that wouldn't always be popular, I think the key element that you did that was a good job was you picked one central theme and then explored it in depth. You didn't try to do like, you know, like a 10-page article, but about a whole team. You pick like one player, one central theme, and then you kind of explored it. So since then, you have also continued the path of the Twitter analysts, who then become, well, you just remove the word Twitter, right? You just become an analyst at that point in time, and then teams pay you to just internally talk shit about other teams and say about how all their drafts are bad and about how their players, you know, here's the scouting report. The only bad part about doing that is then you have to pretend to yourself and those players in that team that they're actually all good now and that they're not complete chumps and that they're not fucking up. You have to pretend like it could still work out. Like H2K could one day make a final of an EU LCS or an ALCS. I almost accidentally said that because I know they'll be in the NALCS next season. Oops, my bad. Anyway, Deficio, don't react. Just pretend like the camera's frozen. People will read into your reactions. So he laughed, he looked away, and then he smiled. Maybe that's the order in which Riot responded to that request. Who knows? So we'll start the episode now. And I didn't let you respond to any of that, Veteran. But do you have any opening remarks?
Well, yeah, I do actually have to criticize the team itself as well at times.
Okay.
I did, and I still do fully believe that one day H2K will make a final, depending on which Chelsea editors, but I definitely fully believe the whole time that we are together, that we were the best team in Europe, and that there were multiple things that went wrong that weren't to do with how we played the game, though I'm sure Kelsey and Deficio are going to have opinions on that. That prevented us from making the finals, even winning the whole thing. I really wish we got a rematch with G2 at Worlds, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that then. Like, didn't you join in? Wasn't it like the off season of season 5 or something, going to season 6?
Yes.
Was that when you joined as the analyst? Okay, so you were. So luckily, that whole statement there wasn't so delusional that he thought like fucking Hjarnan or something was going to win the LCS. He meant like the good H2Ks, the one with Forgiven and Jankos, and now a bunch of Koreans who even knows, no one will remember them. So speaking of these teams, okay, let's start on that topic. Since we've got veteran, let's talk about H2K then, because it's not just a meme, Deficio. Somehow they do make the semis seemingly every split. And most times, since season 6 at least, they do come in as like, if not favourites, then at least like, usually like 50-50, like, oh, whoever they're playing, they could do it, Usually in the regular split, they have those matches where they win against the top team. You think, oh, they could do it this time, but they never do it. Let's go back for a moment in history. Let's go back to the Forgiven lineup. The one where it was Ryu in the mid lane, it was Forgiven as the AD carry, they had Vanda, and obviously the remaining players, they had Odoamne and Jankos. Why do you think these teams never were able to make the LCS finals, or indeed win LCS, even though, at times they were considered a potential favourite? What do you think was wrong with them?
I think one of the problems with the Forgiven lineup that HK had was they literally only had one way of playing the game. That was the effective way, which was so much focused on like super strong early game, win lane, win game kind of strategy. And it was something even when talking to Prolly about it like last year, it kind of accepted this was the one style they could actually use, because I think behind the scenes, they struggle at actually maybe talking to each other properly, actually figuring out in terms of feedback, how could we play the game differently? So I think they just had to kind of commit to the one style with the players they had on the lineup. And to be fair, that was actually very successful for most of the time. So I don't blame them at all for just saying this is the one way we should do it. But I think one thing that's always been interesting to me is like Jankos specifically in playoffs and, in these super, super important games, there will be one best of 5 where he's literally going 10-0 every game and he gets a great start and he just rolls with it and he has so much confidence and momentum. And then the next time he, has a bad game 1 and we just don't see Jankos in game 2 and 3 play like the guy we see in the regular season. So I have never personally worked with him, obviously, and veteran, you might know more about behind the scenes Jankos, but it always felt to me like he's too emotional in the very important best of 5s to actually be able to always reset and be ready for the next game if something went wrong in the first game. And a good example is also this split where he went out after the G2 game on Facebook and said like after he lost the Baron, everything just went downhill and it was really hard for him to kind of, get back in the game. And it's a cool thing because with Jankos, you have this player who has the ability to be like the best player in Europe or one of the best players in Europe when he's really, really, really good. But you don't always see that Jankos show up in the most important games. And that's something I think that there needs to be some sort of reason for that, but maybe he's the only person who can answer it. But I'm not always seeing the godlike Jankos in the correct moments, and that sometimes hurts the team.
Okay. I will definitely say that pressure affected the performance of a lot of players on HGK when it came to playoffs. I will say that we also had a lot of issues in the EU LCS when it came to actually setting up around Baron and our communication around Baron at the same time. I do think that a statement like the one Jankos just made, where after the Baron is stolen, like the series is basically one and done. Like I obviously you can't go in with that type of mentality. Well, I will say that when it comes to Baron specifically, we had a lot of issues prior to Worlds, and I think that was one of the biggest things that we fixed, and it actually fundamentally changed how we played the mid game, the mid to late game coming into Worlds, and how we went to close out games. Because previously there would be a lot of split comms when it came to Baron calls beforehand, and we were essentially watching a lot of EDG games as we were figuring out how we should actually properly be playing around Baron and using Baron when it comes to mid to late game.
When Deficio says that, okay, like it seemed like there were like communication issues, or they couldn't properly analyze, what was going wrong. As he also pointed out as a caveat, because it worked so much during most of the regular splits, like they're one of the top teams, obviously. Sometimes they would beat all the other teams that were considered favorites. When you got to the playoffs, within a team, did you actually, was there ever discussions of these exact topics? That, for example, to me, H2K is the ultimate example of a team that absolutely was good enough to win LCS, but they really were that cliche of, they played not to lose in the semifinals, not to win. They would just, if they ever had, a little advantage, they would never press the advantage, they'd never turn that, they'd never, parlay that into the next advantage, which would win you the game. They would sort of, try not to make the big move that loses you the game, but in doing so, sometimes not capitalize on the chances to win the game, And so it always just felt like, when is the other team gonna take over, or when is one thing gonna go wrong, as you're alluding to here, which ends the whole game? Were people actually cognizant of this inside the team?
I mean, I can definitely think of immediate examples, particularly in the Origin series in spring, where we absolutely had to make a proactive play, and we should know to do that, but for whatever reason, we just didn't on the ground, and it would become an immediate discussion afterwards. And when it came to the Splice series, immediate instances where we should be more proactive, I'm not sure it was about that. I think what affected the Splice series was that we were heavily focusing on one specific composition that we wanted to play, and one very specific way to play it, and we never really corrected. We never really opted to change up once it became obvious that we weren't able to pull it off to perfection. I mean, everybody's made a meme about the fact that we kept doing Gangplank into Gnar, for example. Yeah. But the essential plan was that we could always use the Gangplank ult in tangent with, it was Ashtarm was the combo we were going for bot lane. And we were always going to be going for that combo, and we just weren't pulling it off enough. And we always figured that we just had to pull it off properly, and then the comp would be fine. But even when it became evident that we weren't necessarily pulling off the comp properly, we didn't really change. And I guess we should have just changed up there, to be honest.
I mean, that was
that was the bigger issue.
That was always my essential complaint with H2K. Deficio touched on it before, where he felt like H2K has one way of playing the game. I feel like they always feel that way. I don't think it's just a forgiven thing. I feel like H2K is a team where they have a concept of playing a game with the way the game that should be played, and it's an ideal concept. And then when it doesn't work, they blame their execution instead of adapting on the day. And sometimes they don't even necessarily have something to adapt to on the day, or it doesn't seem like they do. And so they kind of tunnel vision on this aspect. Well, our execution just needs to be better. And I feel like that problem has remained with H2K basically since the very beginning. And this, for me, is why they crumble.
As if she died right on that word there.
There you go.
I
think I have a thing also to add, with this whole, sticking to Gangplank and give Gnar open. I've always felt like with H2K as well that they disrespect comfort picks too much, and the idea that a pick that is not considered S tier by H2K and maybe let's just say the world's meta isn't actually that valuable, even though the other team's player is super, super good on this one champion. Gnar is a good example here, where in that Splice series, it was sure, the GP in theory makes a lot of sense, but you need to also respect that if one player and one team is finding so much success with a specific champion or a specific style, you should just target that style and actually shift around your mentality and your mindset of what is the strongest right now, what is the ideal way to play the game. I think Misfits, that's something they did super well here in the summer playoffs. We've already seen the interviews, we've heard the talks about how they were playing Fnatic. And they're okay, Soaz, if he's on engaged champions like Jarvan, and if he's on this Gnar here, where again he can also start fights and be a split pushing threat, that style is just super good for him and Fnatic. They're we just ban that away. Literally just get rid of that. No matter what. It doesn't even matter if there's a perfect comp anywhere. Get rid of those two champions. And then suddenly this entire comfort style from Soaz and the rest of Fnatic is now changed, and they will be weaker. And I think H2K just don't respect that enough in best of 5 series very often, and they just go for the general OPs and the ideal matchups for how you would actually theorize, as Kelsey said, a perfect game. Instead of just saying this one champion is super good for this one player, let's just get rid of it and force them to show something different and change style.
Okay, I don't necessarily agree with the notion that we always have to be like removing an opposition's comfort picks. Like Fnatic play specifically one style, and they are a beautiful foil, not just because you can ban out that style, but because it's not necessarily a very good style to play. And if people are picking comfort champs, I still do this now on Schalke. Like I didn't really care about Giants Echo comp, for example. Like I really didn't care about that at all. I feel like if he picks that, then it's fine. I disagree with the notion that just because something's comfortable for them will mean that it's good and that you should really take that away from them. I think you can build comps around if they're comfortable on weak and bad stuff. I never really disagreed with Prolly on this notion either. I still don't think that like the composition was the reason that we were losing to Splice. The fact that we couldn't pull it off was the reason that we were losing to Splice. And I think that the solution to that isn't necessarily that we have to just remove all comfort from Splice or something, or that the composition itself is bad. I think we just had to come in with more compositions and more plans and plan Bs and plan Cs.
In that specific example, though, because that's obviously an infamous one where he just continued to play Gangplank into Nart.
Yeah.
You would still justify that draft, even knowing the results? Like, there wasn't an obvious way you could have changed that just in terms of the top lane pick alone?
We went through several sports psychologists with the team over the duration of that season. I think that all of the aspects of HUK that I would fix were not to do strategically. I think it would be all to do with that type of stuff behind the scenes. We needed to make something like that work. I don't just think it needed to be something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with going for perfection.
By the way, Kelsey, we missed your point, by the way, when you made it earlier. So what was your general point?
The point before was just that I think that it's a good idea as a team to go for perfection and to have this idea that, okay, there is an ideal way to play the game, and this is the ideal comp, and this is the ideal response to this champion, the way that they're playing this thing here. But if your execution on the day is not working, then you can't just go back and say, oh, our execution sucks. We can practice this a little bit more and it'll be as confident. Or maybe you don't need more practice, but it's just there's something about the way you're playing on that day that's not good. And then that's when you start adapting. That's when you need a secondary thing that you can play, that you can put into focus. And I feel like H2K never really had that secondary thing that they could pull into play when things were not working. I like going for perfection, but if you're screwing up at that moment, sometimes you can't go for perfection that time.
I mean, it's like that famous saying, isn't it? The perfect is the enemy of the good. It's like if you always are trying to do something incredible, and especially in this case, like the reason why this is a tricky discussion is because really we're not saying H2K couldn't have done these things, because they did them and they worked in the regular split. What we're saying is, unfortunately, if there was any weakness, let's say it was a tiny one, then the mechanism which magnified it was the mental problems that they had in the team when it came to these big matches and high pressure games, etc. That took the tiny issue and made it essentially the central issue. I just want to ask you this then, because obviously we want to know about Prolly and the coaching aspect. This might sound like a weird way to say it, but believe it or not, the fact that H2K failed with these good teams so many times in the semis and against teams that were beatable for them, not that they should have beaten them all, but they certainly could have, is the point. The reason why that to me actually always said to me that this is a very well-coached team is because, kind of to tie into Kelsey's concept that they would always have this one style of play, they looked to me like some traditional sports teams I've seen where they have that manager, the coach, who's like a really good tactician. And what he does is he has his philosophy, like, this is the way we play the game at the moment. Here's like our general rule set of, like, you know, the flow chart of what we do at this point in the game and how I want you to respond, and here's your role. And he does a great job of setting out the blueprint. This is how we're going to play the game. So when people do that, you only need that style. You win off it. It works really well. It does make sense of your personnel. But when you get to the scenario where something goes wrong in the game or the player's mentality is broken, that's why I've always called into question like elements of the shot calling in H2K, because they never felt like a team who could adapt when it was going wrong or when what they were trying to do wasn't working. So to me, that actually says very good coaching, because basically everything up to you going to the server sounds like he's outlined how you should do it, etc. But then in the game, they don't have the Aframu or the High or one of these famous players who can sort of do coaching in the game as it's going on and figure out here's a viable approach that, at least based on what we're currently doing, would work. How was the coaching relationship in terms of this problem here? 'Cause it sounds like it seems like it's something that's haunted probably for his whole career.
Sure. So Prolly, it was never like we sat people down and were like, you do this, you do this, you do this, and this is what we practice for the week. But Prolly was bloody good at creating a game plan for the next week over the course of that week and during scrims. Like he was incredibly tactically sound when it comes to the game. And I thought it was a bit of a shame that he tried to put so much of our style last season onto Forgiven, because it was actually a very good style, and I fully credit Prolly with that from behind the scenes. And I don't think that this is another reason why I will never say it was any sort of strategical aspect when it comes to the game of why we would lose, because I feel like Prolly did everything he could with that. I feel like he knew much more about the game than all of his opposing coaches, and he was very good at setting us up in that manner. I think that all shot calling issues and stuff like that on the ground had to be fixed in like other ways, and I wish that all of those ways had worked. Maybe we could have just been a bit less stubborn about like moving to plan B or plan C, sure, but that's also somewhat on the players.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say for sure that Prolly is the smartest coach like I've ever talked to when it comes to understanding the game itself, like the macro part of the game, and he's super, super good at that. So, and that's kind of the thing with the point I made earlier, and the thing Kelsey talked about as well. Like, I think it's fine to go for perfection and practice for perfection, go into game one of a series with that idea of like, we have this game plan, we do this in the early game, we do then this in the mid game, and this is how we're going to execute the comp, and this is everything we're doing, and this is how we counter whatever this other team is going to play. But that's why I just feel like doing a series, adaptation is just so needed, and the best teams in the world can adapt. They're flexible, they can play different styles. If the early game doesn't work because the enemy team has mechanically great players, and they can just go even lane, maybe even beat you in lane, you have to be able to change. And that definitely is something that haunts H2K, and that's where, again, to my point with the comfort picks, like sometimes it is just easy if there's one specific champion or pick that is a problem for you in a game 2, a game 3, a game 4 in a series, maybe just removing it at least for one game to see if it changes anything could actually help. But that's obviously just a difference in mindset during the day. But I think it's always something that has held HK a bit back in best of series.
One of the reasons why I'm really against you on that specific point is that I feel like some of our plans were messed up because we would do last minute changes due to player comfort on our end. Like
the most famous one is like in game 5's just letting like, okay, Ryu, what do you want to play? Just pick whatever that is. That sort of example, right?
I think
yes, that sort of example.
I think because I actually recently reviewed the series because I wanted to talk about it before H2K's playoffs and talking about like why they failed in the past. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that they screwed up because of the NAR. There were games where they, like, another really big H2K problem from my perspective is always going, so you get a good setup, right? You have your vision in place, you have the lanes pushing, and then you have a really good skirmish or a team fight. And then you go from there, you decide, okay, we're going to split focus and we're going to go for dragon and we're going to go for this turret. And if you get these things afterwards, someone on the team might be saying, oh, okay, we still have time, we can get like this turret here. And then they keep overreaching for these things on advantage instead of like taking a good time to back and reset so that they can maintain tempo in the game. And then, like, I remember in game 5 specifically, there was this dragon play and a dive bot at the same time. And they went super hard on the dive bot. And the game turned based on this TP. And yeah, sure, the NAR got the triple kill and took off on the game on that. But it was like, I feel like these mistakes were the bigger problems than just the NAR pick in general. Because it wasn't even that the NAR pick was like super comfort for Wonder. It was that the NAR pick was just like really good at taking those advantages because a lot of these top lane picks were super snowbally and stuff like this. So for me, I think that, yeah.
I mean, players see a success and they want to go all the way of it and see how much they can abuse it, like in the moment. And that's definitely something that you want to avoid. But that is something that was handled strategically in post-scrim talks, though generally speaking in like earlier portions of the game. So when it came to lane swaps specifically, this was also an issue really early on in swing, but one that like, you've crashed the wave, this is the end of the play. Now what's the next play? And that would prevent you from like trying to siege a turret for too long because you don't have any specific play you're trying to make there, unless you're trying to set up a dive or something. But you won't do that unless it's an obvious one. So it prevents the player just trying to get so much out of the fact that they have a minor tempo advantage now Instead, they'll set up vision and back and try to take next Drake or something like that. Like, that's the way that we would avoid it in early game. That wouldn't transfer into late game sometimes because we didn't have such a structured manner of how to play mid to late game until Worlds came about. So I'll always come back to, like, once we figured out how to do Baron properly during the Korean bootcamp, that was when HGK became a team where, like, I really wish we could play G2 in quarters or something like that, or semis, or however far we'd have to get before we were actually able to play them. Like, I figured at that point there's no way that we would lose. But when you get to, like, later games, like Game 4s, Game 5s, players will forget a lot of these systems, and they'll just see, oh, we had advantage, oh, we're actually about to win. And that will take over everything that they've been taught during scrims and in post-scrim talks. I'll always go back to the mentality thing.
So obviously within the Season 6 team, a huge figure, just not only from his name, but his presence, was Forgiven, because he's someone where... Okay, this is the question I have. Obviously, for most of the period where he was in the lineup, he was actually pretty well integrated. Like, it was working very well in the team. Obviously, for Worlds, it worked fantastically. But as someone who watched him before he joined the team and then got, in theory, to work around him and get to know what this guy's like, right? One storyline that I think is so fucking whack in League of Legends, particularly in League, though, because people are so big on the narratives, is this notion that when you have a player who is very hard to deal with, that, like, if they then play in a manner which works and the team works in terms of results and they don't seem to have a lot of complaints about them from their teammates, that meant, they were reformed or they matured magically in a week, The reason why that's so whack is because, to me, that was never the principle. Like, for example, okay, the perfect example to me is Doublelift. Because I don't believe, magically, that Doublelift one day was just this asshole for years and years, and then suddenly his team started winning, and CLG won the championship, and TSM won the championship, and that meant that he'd reformed as a person. What I think happened, and this is something I always said about Doublelift, is from getting to know those CLG players that he played with his teammates on a personal level, he was surrounded by too many people who were the wrong sort of personality type to balance out or be able to deal with his personality type. So yes, his personality type was very demanding. It was very difficult to work with. So you needed people who either were, like, very strong-minded and they could just take abuse, and they don't get bothered by it as long as it's working in the game. Or you need someone who can sometimes temper that, like an Aframu type character, maybe, who can deal with it and channel it in a different direction. Or you need people who they just don't mind, Some people just have a very kind of stoic mentality and they can play regardless. So I always felt like with Forgiven, that was the real goal. It's to get players who either they agree to be in the position he needs them to be in for the team to work, or they can just handle his personality, Because there's no way, unless you had some world-class psychologist, you're going to change the guy's whole outlook overnight. So how did they integrate him into H2K? What was your experiences like, in theory, dealing with this guy, for good or ill?
First of all, if I had to take, like, one person out of HK and be like, your personality is why the whole thing didn't work, it wouldn't be Forgiven. I think Forgiven gets, like, a pretty bad rap. He's far from, like, a perfect human being or something. I do think Vander was the perfect support for him, because Vander is, like, an absolute rock when it comes to your personality, and Forgiven would be very opinionated specifically on how the 2v2 should have gone after a lot of scrim sets, and Vander was perfectly fine with that. Like, Vander would be completely unaffected by that sort of thing. But Forgiven, for example, is actually very silent when it comes to comms. So whereas he demands perfection, it's not like he's interrupting anything in game. So Jankos and Oda Wamne and Ryu as well would be making a lot of the calls. Most of the time it came down to, like, Oda Wamne and Jankos. If we had, like, all three lanes winning, Ryu would suddenly become very vocal. And Forgiven never interrupted any of that, though he definitely did expect more. Is that a flaw, though, by the way?
Because I have noticed, talking to him personally, every time they would lose and he would give me his version of things, it lines up with what you're saying here. There was never a time he ever said something like, oh, we decided to TP bot and do this, or, we pushed here as a group, and, like, I thought that we should do that, we did it wrong. It's always like, the others made the choice and I just did it, He almost, like, I almost wonder if that's, like, listen, maybe he's not the main shot caller, sure, but it feels like he only wanted to be responsible for his individual play.
Yes, he does. I think if it was any position other than ADC, I would have a huge issue with it. But since it's ADC, I'm perfectly fine with him being like a sentry turret that takes towers obscenely fast and prioritizes the right targets in every team fight. Like, I'm fine if he's willing to be moved around like a sentry turret. And so then the reason that I figure a lot of people end up not liking Forgiven is that he'll still be very critical of all of the other macro elements, even if he's not necessarily taking a part in it.
Could he actually have had like some shot calling though in terms of what team fights today? Because that's a skill I've always observed in him. He's always been very good at knowing like exactly where to position himself in a team fight, like how they're going to target him, how they're going to come in on him. In theory, shouldn't someone like that be able to give some input on like, let's not take this team fight now, you know?
But he's good macro-wise as well, because it's not like, okay, I will say that he's like 99% silent, but the few times when he would talk and he would just say, no, we swap now, instead of like taking a fight or something, he is actually 100% correct. Like he does say that sometimes if we're playing around him on a sideline. He doesn't want more responsibility than that though. Like I think that would be my biggest criticism of Forgiven. Do I think he is a phenomenal lady carry? I think he could be going some way to pulling himself out of this, out of whatever right he might feel like he's in, and take a more responsible role in the team. But he very much wants to trust other people to do it and expects perfection when he does.
What did you think of the Forgiven era H2K Deficio?
I don't know. It's actually hard because I really liked the team. I loved actually, especially at Worlds, when they really developed, like when they really managed to succeed with the whole like super aggressive early game, play around Odo Amne on carries, top lane like Jace, get him fed while Vander and Forgiven just 2v2s in the bot lane and just like almost never loses the 2v2 except for the one Vander. He did a weird face check level 1 if I remember correctly. And apart from that, they would just always be super solid in 2v2. Like that style of H2K when they played like that at Worlds was super, super good in my opinion. And a lot of it also comes down to Odo Amne being so good with an advantage. Like when he actually wins lane, he's really good at like using that advantage to snowball other lanes on the side, at least during Worlds. That was very successful. So I like that style a lot, but I don't know if from the outside it just felt like it was hard for the team to progress further than that, and that maybe was due to clash of personalities that just made it difficult to actually say now we're going to play a completely different style of League of Legends if the meta like swapped away and everything. So in that case, it always seemed like this was a really good thing for H2K to play a strong early game. But that was the thing for H2K to do, and if that ever changed, I'm not sure if this team could have adapted.
Okay, so Kelsey's connection is probably having some issues, so we're going to try, in case anyone was wondering, just using an image of her and the vocal and hope it works. So can you repeat what the rough point was you were making before the problems?
Yeah.
Proceed to do so, please.
I felt like there was almost a timelessness to the way that last H2K roster played, because now if you see this team, you have like this ideal setup where strong mid, top, strong bot, you can use the pressure from these side lanes to then transfer at mid as long as you have just like a stable wave clear mid matchup. What happened with H2K, I think, was that they had the foundation for how to play around waves, what to do in order. Once the turrets started to fall, it almost felt like they lost the ability to play around waves because so much of the backing was determined, or so much of how they played and how the tempo of the game, the way they saw it, was determined by how the wave was bouncing or crashing against the next turret. And so when you start to lose these types of plays and this type of advantage and there are no more turrets, it's almost like they panic because suddenly they have to play around a different kind of objective. So I think that's something that once you have the foundation of understanding like when you can make a play on a wave or when you have advantage, you then have to be able to take these basic concepts and transition it to what you do with other objectives in play, which I think was where they were kind of skipping stuff and where they were kind of losing. But the basic foundation of how they were playing, I thought was really good.
There was definitely a philosophy in Spring that if we have a winning lane set up now, there's absolutely no reason to get rid of it, to change setup whatsoever. And we would just hold that until enemy had to back and we would back on the advantage. We would take jungle, we'd take everything that we could up until that point. Playing around bouncing or pushing waves is the way you should play the game anyway. And yes, that was obviously what we were playing around as well. For a large amount of it, but doing that and pivoting around an objective like Baron or Elder, mostly Baron, wasn't the content that we had like fully down for a while, and that would be our big weakness.
Okay, you have any thoughts on that, Deficio?
No, I agree 100%. I think it was always the thing during the semifinal against Samsung where I think most people felt very confident that HK would win or could win the early game and actually could get like big leads, but then the late game from Samsung would just be like far superior to HK's late game. Sure. So it always felt like they were against the clock every single time, and seeing as that was not possible to fix quickly during Worlds, it was a series where they really needed to snowball so hard.
The Echo pick put us on like a huge timer during the Samsung series, and we definitely weren't decisive enough in closing out in first game. So I'd agree with that.
But that's where like what could be interesting was, let's just pretend this HK lineup stayed together for another year, and as Kelsey said, they kind of stuck to this style of like try and really play strong carries top and snowball top lane with your jungler and have the strong 2v2 bot lane and try and really perfect closing out games. I mean, there is a world where you could see that, be super successful. Again, I think a small example, not a pure 1-to-1, but like Longshu with Khan in top lane, we're seeing this like carry top lane style being actually successful. If you are just super good at playing the style. Problem is for most Western teams, and this is where it even goes back to some of the comfort parts, but for most Western teams, cleanly snowballing games is so difficult to do. And in the current meta, when you play against all these big tank comps, if you make a mistake with your carry top laner and he falls behind, like the game is almost over just based on that. So for the vast majority of teams in the world who are not the absolute S-tier, like complete S-tier teams, and we only have very few of them, it is just much safer and easier to play these like tank comps and not have to rely on early game snowballing into perfect Baron setup into finishing the game before you go too late. And that's probably where this HK lineup would still have found issues.
I just said that I think it doesn't, like right now you don't necessarily have to play carry top, like just having a strong matchup, even if a strong take matchup, I think that style would still work as long as you have like just this even if, okay, let's say you have Maokai or Jarvan winning lane and the lane has advantage and you don't even necessarily have to stand the jungler, then you go mid and you immediately dive mid and you get mid ahead that way. And because you're playing a ton of wave clear mids or whatever, then if you take the first turret like this, then Orianna or something like this can't really stay in the lane or get access to the farm, and it's really easy to get mid control from there and then go to a bunch of different objectives. So theoretically, even if you have like a tank top, I think you can still play strong top, strong bottom, wave clear mid style, and it's good.
So when you were saying there, Veteran, you were going to say something about KT Rolstead. Did you mean the one at that time with Someday, or do you mean the one now?
The one now runs into the same issues that HGK ran into, was what I was going to say.
Okay, how so?
Well, KT are also a team that right now, Deficio was saying that that we would have found issue like snowballing lanes and playing out a split strategy in the current meta, and I was saying that KT are finding that to be the case right now. Like Samsung were really abusing them in the gauntlet recently with a very Baron-centric composition that forced them into these fights when they would otherwise prefer to be maintaining pressure on side lanes. Like it was a really good counter to how Smeb likes to play. And the HGK from last season probably would have run into those same issues at around this point. And it's an issue that we also ran into in Schalke. And you have to play much more patiently, but also if people are playing compositions the way that Samsung were playing them, then it's almost going to be unavoidable. They're going to be drawn into these fights and you're going to lose.
In that Samsung series, did you agree with the decision to just give Forgiven several games?
I thought we could play the Jhin. That would be my biggest thing. We actually had played Jhin in scrims. There's this huge meme that Forgiven couldn't play Jhin or whatever, and that was patently false. And we were playing Jhin in scrims against SKT, and we were actually doing well with it. So I actually really thought we should be breaking out the Jhin for that series. When it comes to the Sivir pick and the Sivir memes, I do have to say, Forgiven absolutely loves Sivir and wants to play Sivir more often than not. It's his decision to play Sivir a lot of the times, and that got put onto Prolly a lot in comment sections and stuff, and I was just sat there thinking, you guys have no clue what you're talking about. Forgiven loves Sivir to death. Like, he would want it even in situations where it wasn't, like, optional.
Okay, so...
also adding on to that real quick, just super tiny,
like... Take as long as you want, mate.
Like, this whole, like, you blame the coach for the Sivir pick 3 times in a row, like, it was very clear that you guys needed some sort of wave clear and wave push as well. At least from how you were drafting. And Sivir seemed to be the answer for that in these drafts.
Sivir was always our answer for that.
Exactly. Yes. So it wasn't like Prolly just said, oh, I love Sivir so much, everything else is garbage, let's just play Kidoni. Like, they needed something that could push lanes really effectively. She's the best AD carry for that at the time, and Jhin would not have solved that issue specifically. They would have to probably change up a little bit more in terms of how they were drafting if they wanted to play the Jhin, which probably could have worked. Like, it was a big pick in general, but I think still, like, I remember reading the same comments about how dumb is the coach is putting Sivir every single time, but there was a very clear reason, and the reason made a lot of sense. So
yeah. No, I agree with that. I definitely wasn't saying that Sivir was a bad pick and you should blame Forgiven for the picks, but we were playing composition specific to Jhin and we were doing success of it. So if I'm asked about whether we should have been picking Sivir or not, I'd say I actually really wanted to bring out the Jhin compositions. I was one of his better champions.
I agree with you. I disagree with the comments.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing about the Sivir pick is I had actually interviewed Forgiven right after the series against... Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name suddenly. Sorry.
Albus Nox Luna. Was the wild
card. Yeah. Albus Nox. I interviewed him after Albus Nox Luna, and he had played Sivir in those series as well, because I wanted him to talk about the Sivir pick, because it seemed like a Forgiven champion. But he was picking it not necessarily into the best matchups, and he was saying, I can win this anyway because I'm Forgiven. So I think he was perfectly happy playing a champion that he was comfortable on in a matchup that he thought was bad, just because he felt like he could win the matchup anyway. And that kind of transferred into the Samsung series most likely if Forgiven had a say in what he was playing.
More specifically, it was very difficult for the opponents to actually set up their usual 4v2 dive that they love to do in Forgiven's head. They always want to do on him. So Sivir was a very good pick to avoid that as well. The way it no longer exists.
So to update this conversation to Season 7 then, like if you're not, like ideally I tried to get the Forgiven stuff out of the way because obviously he's not on the team anymore.
Can I put like a quick, can I say one quick last thing
you're
about
doing it now, keep going.
HGK thing then? Because with when it comes to Forgiven, I will absolutely never like blame him for everything that went wrong in H2K. I absolutely think that H2K should have stuck with the Forgiven Van the bot lane. Like that would be my biggest disagreement with the way that they went. And Forgiven was never like I have said that like he would be really hard on like the 2v2 stuff. He did have opinions on macro and stuff, but he more or less let everybody like discuss it, and we'd all formulate our own opinions, etc. And he would be very trusting of the whole thing. And he's an AD that I would absolutely work with again. And while I think that more people should be willing to work with a player as opinionated as him, and I think that his reputation has made it far easier for players to hone in on him as an issue, even when he's not being an issue. And when it comes to Prolly, because he's getting like a bad rap right now, I do still think that I know a lot of the coaches in the EU LCS, and I don't think any of them would be insulted if I say that Prolly is still by far the best when it comes to game knowledge. And I would not have left my rather comfy freelance job at the Score to join any other team. Like I absolutely had to work with Prolly. Like I had to learn from this guy, and I wouldn't be where I am right now without him.
Well, I mean, there's no need to diss him at the end there, but you know.
Huh?
Just no need to diss him by saying you wouldn't be where you are now without him, you know? I mean, you know. Yeah, sorry, you'll get that one later anyway. So here's the question. To update the conversation to Season 7, I want to ask about Jankos, because he's obviously been a central part of this theme because he has his own meme, which people don't realise, which is that he always gets banged out in the semis and every team he is on pretty much, except Rockhat because they weren't even good enough to make the playoffs. But going back throughout his career, he has also had a problem in the semi-finals. Now, perhaps the best example of how bad it can go for Jankos was actually that Worlds, where he had that game against Samsung where he was on Olaf, where he was like, wasn't he like 8 kills up or something mental in like the first 10 minutes? And they couldn't transfer that to any kind of like macro control or winning the game. It ended up like it's bizarre to think that a jungler could have 8 kills and basically it lead to nothing, you know. But what do you see, Deficio? What broad strokes here, or you can be specific about this semi-final here, the one against G2. What do you think Jankos' issues have been in these big matches?
One thing I try to always avoid is talk about like emotional states of players, because I'm not in their brains. Like I can't see what, you know, Jankos is thinking or feeling at the moment.
Read it now.
Yeah, now I could read some of it, obviously, which confirms a few things. But I think it's hard with Jankos because I think he's such a gifted player, both mechanically, but also like his knowledge of jungle and matchup and where he should apply pressure in the early game. It just seems to me like when things do not follow the game plan 100%, Jankos might not always be the best guy to say, okay, stop, what are we doing? Let's rethink our strategy and then, you know, kind of adapt to what's happening in game. And I think also one thing he does is he gambles a lot in game. With some plays he's making. And this has been something the entire split, not just in playoffs. But I think there's a lot of moments where he's going for a play that is a 50-50 that he maybe didn't have to go for. And he's trusting his synergy with whoever he's doing it with, or his own mechanical skill will put him on top of the situation. And when he then is when he's against the best teams, those teams tend to have players who can actually then almost at least match the mechanical skill of Jankos, and therefore the same 50-50 might not always work out, or maybe that team has a slightly better 2v2 setup. One example is from the G2 series when it was Sejuani Jarvan on G2 side against Cho'Gath Gragas on H2K side, and Jankos went top for the 2v2 skirmish, and they got completely destroyed because Sejuani with a melee top lane champion is just fantastic and just quick 2v2s with his stun and burst as well from that. And they lost that 2v2 pretty quickly. And maybe they should never gone for that in the first place due to the risk of that exact thing happening. And that's where maybe I see something for Jankos that might not always make him shine in the big best of fives, which is a shame because, again, I think he's mechanically so super gifted and definitely one of my favorite players to watch, like in every season he's playing.
Okay, Kelsey, do you have a theme or a thought in mind?
Regarding Jankos, I think H2K get a lot off of understanding, like having really good comms around their jungler and knowing how to play around their jungler better than most teams in Europe right now. I think that this is a really big factor in the fact that Jankos is mechanically good and can do stuff with those advantages. It could also play to the 50-50 stuff that Deficio was discussing, because it's like, okay, if Odoamne will almost always have the wave prepped for a gank, and you know the enemy top laner doesn't really understand like how the gank setup has to work or isn't doing it correctly all the time, then you can sort of know that you're more likely to get away with it. Right, and I think that this can foster a sense of bad play or a sense of over-eager play. But in general, I feel like H2K get a lot out of the fact that they have really good comms around their jungler, and their jungler plays like really well to pressure. And this is just something that most of Europe is really, really far behind in right now. But we can get into that a little bit later when we talk about like the Fnatic series.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, I think Jankos was definitely one of the biggest positives HGK had over Fnatic when it came to that specific series, and if they won, it would definitely have been off of that.
So, Veteran, what do you think the issues were? Obviously, you're not in the team anymore, but as an outsider, what were the issues that meant that H2K got swept by G2? Like, did you actually believe going in this team could do it?
You mean Fnatic or? Oh no,
when H2K
getting swept by
lost to
G2.
G2 in the semis.
Wait, no. I did assume that G2 would win. I did think that H2K had. I mean, I did think H2K had a shot. I absolutely wasn't surprised when G2 swept whatsoever. I do kind of agree with Deficio that Jankos goes for a lot of 50-50 plays. I think Cho'Gath priority was a bit strange on H2K's side. I think a lot of their priorities are typically strange, generally speaking, but it wasn't a big shock to me that they lost to G2 at all.
Okay. What would they have had to do to win?
To win? I mean, they had to play a lot more patiently than they did, basically, which is what it comes down to on a lot of their series.
I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think they got kind of trigger shy after the first game and started to try to play towards maybe just this kind of weird Cho'Gath priority. They had a lot of losing lanes. I felt like the drafts in the H2K G2 series were just like G2 they let G2 walk all over them in a lot of ways in the second and third games.
Yes, I mean they had a weird understanding of like the Tristana Jarvan trade, for example, and I feel like you should always be going for Tristana. Like if you leave both Tristana Jarvan up, you have to be going for Tristana every time. And if one is banned, you have to ban the other. And I feel like they didn't understand that on the day. And I feel like their early Cho priority, they were definitely disrespecting a lot of picks that can be picked into it. I can name a lot of picks off the top of my head that are actually really good into Cho. You can save it for after second ban phase. And I feel like Oda1 has a different understanding of a lot of those matchups than I do.
It's pretty common among European teams. Yeah, I think right now high Cho priority is like really, really, really common in EU.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it is based on scrim success. Obviously, with the champion way in scrims, teams can play around the Cho'Gath very easily. There's a lot of fights. He gets 1 or 2 kills in the early game, and then he just becomes unkillable. I think Gnar was the biggest one that teams had issues with on stage when you play Cho'Gath, just because once he gets like Black Cleaver, it's a little bit annoying for you to sit in the 1v1 against him, and you kind of rely on your team having a strong 4-man group to put pressure, so now can't split push, and that didn't always happen for the teams, and then Cho ended up losing quite a lot of games. But also another thing about the HK G2 series that has happened actually now in 2 playoffs in a row is that Nuclear and Che in the pure 2v2 lane struggle against the absolute best 2v2 lanes in Europe. And this is not necessarily just based on picks, but even when they had even matchups, they would like die 2v2 or fall really far down. Even in the Fnatic series in 3rd place, when they were playing against a Xayah from Reckless in game 1 and 2, while obviously he's a great Xayah player, at like 10 minutes you shouldn't be down like 20 CS already when they're playing Sivir, Alistar or something. I don't remember what support they had, but Sivir at least AD carry. And that makes it super hard as well. In the early game, if your bot lane in most of the games is actually struggling in the pure 2v2 based on your skills and your knowledge of the matchup. Because it also makes it really hard to draft as a coach, knowing that you need to draft almost a superior 2v2 lane for Nuclear and Che, and they might not even then actually dominate the game from it. They might just get slightly ahead and then nothing more.
Okay. With this contrasting this team against the one from last year, like when Jankos had Ryu as his mid laner, in general, when I think of Ryu, I think of like someone who's got all the qualities you want in a veteran, right? You know, has played long enough, like he's not going to do anything outrageously cocky or something, you know, he's going to play reasonably safe, he's going to make sure he gets to the mid game, he's able to have an impact on the team. If you have Febiven as your mid, on paper, you would think this should be like Gank City, right? This is a guy who wants to be a duelist, to take fights, etc. Is the meta at the moment with having tank junglers and having, I mean, mids at the moment, a lot of them just play, like obviously Febiven plays shit like Orianna, etc. now. Was it just not viable to have? Was it not viable to just get Febiven rolling in series?
No, it was super viable. Ganking mid early was like one of the best strategies in playoffs. Yes. Like even on even on Gragas, you know, who's
but you're not going to do that with Nunu.
No, not with Nunu. Not with Nunu. Yeah, not really with the Kane either. But like if you like Gragas is a good example of a tank jungler who's really good at ganking mid. And one thing some teams like Misfits had so much success with was picking a mid laner with CC setup like Syndra. and then pick a tank jungler who can actually like gank lanes in the early game, and then you literally just combine that to try and shut down an Orianna or a Cassiopeia, whatever low mobility mage you are against in the early game. And then when you start winning mid, you just need to start focusing on winning one other side, and you have 2 winning lanes in the game, and playing the mid to late game is much, much easier, especially when Alfario was getting like Gnar in some of the games and he could like become a split pushing threat. So that strategy was viable. HK also tried to play that strategy in some of the games. They even tried so hard that when they picked Orianna Sejuani, which is not a great 2v2 pre-level 6 anything like gank comp, they would still just go mid lane against Fnatic like 3-4 times. And by doing that so many times, they finally actually got a kill and advantage for Febiven, and he used that advantage to also be a big carry in the game. So going mid was definitely viable and something they tried to do in some of the games, but didn't always have the best setup for it.
Yeah, I mean, the G2 series showed them that, I think, the strength of Sejuani, because they kept picking Gragas into multiple times, and Sejuani is a decent response to that. I think they had much better control of mid lane. Jankos and Forbidden worked much better than Boxer and Caps did in the Fnatic series in general. Like, I think first game, Boxer did like this weird full clear and double race, and Sejuani got like a free gank off during this whole time before Boxer had even backed. And they essentially won all the games that they won because they had a vastly superior control of mid lane.
And that was the other thing, the big contrast between H2K and Fnatic is that when Fnatic had like bot lead, they wouldn't necessarily use it to get pressure mid. Generally speaking, H2K were much more about pressure mid, and I think that was why they got a lot of advantages, and Fnatic only really adapted in one game 2 when there was like this super easy setup for Broxa to come gank mid. So yeah, absolutely, it's viable.
Yeah, this is why I think Misfits match up really well versus Fnatic. Like, they're really good at that in playoffs, at least.
Okay, so actually, let's talk then about to finish up the H2K topic. So they obviously played the 3rd place game against Fnatic, right? From having seen these series, what can we conclude about H2K, the current lineup that they have? Like, are these things where they just made some small errors that they're going to fix? They're going to be absolutely fine going forwards, and they can keep this lineup. There's no need to have to change players in the future. What do you think of this lineup, having seen them now tested in the playoffs properly?
I mean, yeah, you first then.
Like Deficio said, their bot lane is really weird, at least in playoffs. I think that the bot lane jungle synergy improved a lot in summer, because in spring it just felt like Jankos didn't want to go bottom at all. The communication between Jankos and the Nuclear and Che was really terrible, because he almost never went bot even when it made sense to play around bot. But I think they fixed a lot of those problems going into summer. But when you get to the point where your bottom lane is just kind of losing almost everything, and then theoretically H2K Fnatic have setups where they can dive you, Fnatic have setups where they could play around bot side much more and do way more with bot pressure than they did and then didn't. Like, that's really, really worrying that you still lost in that regard. So I think that's whereas G2, I think, used it much, much better in the G2 series. So for me, that's a more worrying thing when they're going into the gauntlet. And that's a problem with the current lineup. I don't know if it's something that Nuclear and Che can fix if you just kind of sit down with them and help them go over matchups or what, but it seems to be an issue for them in the past 2 series that they've had.
Okay. Do you think going forwards, like, is there a way to hide that problem, like in the gauntlet or whatever, or going forwards from beyond this?
I don't think H2K win gauntlet. That's what you're asking. I think Splice are the strongest team going into the gauntlet, and I actually think that Splice have a very strong chance of taking the whole thing, because Unicorns have such a vast issue with the meta right now. I don't think H2K will shore up their issues in time. And honestly, actually, I'm cautiously optimistic for Fnatic, because over the course of the H2K series, they showed that they are fixing their issues, or at least they recognize their issues with playing around mid and playing through mid before they make plays on side lane. Like, the difference between game 1 and game 2 in terms of this was night and day, particularly with Boxer, to the point where I assumed that they literally sat them down and talked about it between games. Like it was legitimately night and day. But I'm not entirely sure HGK will shore up the issues that they need to shore up. Like they're still going to be the same old overextending HGK at the end, when it gets to a longer series. I'm pretty convinced, and I don't think you can just sit down nuclear and change your entire philosophy on how to play certain matches in certain situations. In they have 4 days? How long do they have before Gauntlet begins?
It's in 3 days. So
3 days.
Friday. They're playing Friday.
Yeah, I'm not that optimistic by HGK. I hope they prove me wrong, but I'm not that optimistic. I'm optimistic for Splice and Fnatic.
They did actually fly home right after they played. They didn't stay to watch the final or anything. So they went home on a Sunday to go straight back to scrimming and getting ready for Friday. So,
do you think they'll make it out the Gauntlet Deficio?
They're definitely not my favorites to make it out. I think right now I have Fnatic as my favorite, mainly based on them being the last team who actually plays, and they need to have one BO5, so they get to sit and watch the other 3 teams play each other all the way to the actual best of 5 on this Sunday. I think HGK though, the nuclear J problem is hard to fix because they might literally just come down to actual laning skills just being worse than, let's say, Reckless and Jessis or Sven and Mithy as 2 examples, and even Copy and Mickey I think are 2 super good laners on the side of Splice. Hide it, you need picks like Alistar who can try and neutralize a lane. Tom Kench maybe could even try and do it. That might be a way for them to do it and not put Che on big playmakers like Thresh or Rakan if that means he's going to struggle in lane. But even Rakan actually might work because he's pretty safe in many ways. So I think there's ways around it to try and hide the bot lane as much as possible. And then it's just on the other 3 players. If Jankos plays super well and he camps around Feb and Feb plays things like Syndra and actually gets ahead from that and uses that advantage to then protect Nuclear Che and potentially even, if they can, have Rodamno be super strong on things like Renekton. That was a good pick for him against Fnatic. Then I can see HGK do serious damage. I don't want to count them out. And this is not like HGK bias or anything, but I think them, Splice, and Fnatic, all 3 teams would be very, very even. And Unicorns of Love is just this team where they've sat home for 3 weeks now. Surely they're not going to show up and just pick Talon again when it's been 3 weeks of them trying to figure out what is the exact thing they need to play. I'm just saying, surely they will have tried to adapt. They will have tried to adapt. I believe in that, and it makes them. Please tell me they have.
No, they don't. Okay, so here's the thing with Unicorns, and almost all of the assumptions that I had about them were confirmed after I was able to actually come to Berlin and talk to the team in terms of interviews and stuff like this. This is just straight up one of the most telling conversations is at Rift Rivals. I'm talking to Exile. I'm interviewing him, and I ask him about his struggles in the mid lane and everything else, and he says that he thinks he's really having a hard time with matchups, and he just has to sit down and struggle and study these matchups. And then as the games are progressing, I'm noticing that more supports are with lane pressure, going mid and ganking mid, and he's dying a lot more to this type of pressure. So he starts just playing mid lanes with escapes, mid lanes with Vladimir, mid lanes with Talon, mid lanes like Talon, mid lanes like LeBlanc. And then I have an interview with him and Sheepy, and I ask him about these matchups. I ask him why he's picking these champions, and he says, but frankly, I die a lot on other champions, and yes, I'm still working on matchups and everything like this. And I go to Sheepy, and I said, when you have a player who's struggling with matchups and understanding how this works, he just says, I don't do matchups. And they say that about all of these early game criticisms and everything, they had this really strong early game against Splice, right? Where they're doing all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so you guys have been working on early game, right? He's like, no, it's just sometimes our comfort picks are also early game champions. So they literally when they start to lose, when they start to screw up, they just tunnel harder on comfort. So I have zero faith in Unicorns at all.
And then you were like, what about the problems winning games? He was like, listen, I don't do winning games. It's Unicorns of Love. What are you talking about? Now if you excuse me, and then he zips up a fucking unicorn onesie and walks off.
But at the very least, even if you don't understand the matchup, if a player is struggling with a matchup, you can always just sit them down one-on-one and go through a replay where they're evidently struggling with this matchup and just go through it with them. Like, I don't think you can ever say, like, oh, I just don't do matchups and then just shrug it off. You can always help.
Yeah, but the problem is if you say that, then that Remain guy comes in, he goes, whoa, 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 no toxicity in here. Whoa, no criticisms. Come on, guys. We've got to believe in each other. No Koreans. All get the fuck out. Like, and we're all going to make it to Worlds in the end. Don't worry, everyone.
I do think it's actually kind of funny thinking about EOL, because you'd figure that in the current meta, where people are just picking straight up teamfight comps and running mid half the time, and it works out because no team in Europe is perfect. Everyone is far from perfect, in fact, and they always find someone that they can engage on in this manner. You'd figure that a team like EOL that typically just runs up mid and tries to find as many fights as they fucking can would do really well in this, but they can't, because their mid laner is more concerned with how can I avoid this gank from the support, apparently, then he is figuring out matchups that would work well with compositions that do exactly what Unicorns have always tried to do. I think that like Exile is going to end up really tagging the team down.
To add on to that point super quickly, like the fact that everyone started playing teamfight comps actually removed Unicorns of Love's main strength, which was pick super like good scaling comps, and then if the enemy team messed up, your Vladimir would suddenly get 3 kills in a team fight, and then bam, you're now winning the game. And that got kind of removed because almost every draft right now is actually pretty strong in the late game.
Yeah.
So they didn't get that advantage, and that's where the big issues with losing early game and then also not even be able to win late game because the enemy team is sitting with 3 tanks and a hyper carry. You're like, well, the game is just done. You just lose straight away, which is why like if Exile shows up and actually plays Syndra, if he plays Orianna, if he plays Cassiopeia. Funny enough, 2 of those picks he's actually played before, like Syndra and Cassiopeia. If he can do that, and obviously if Unicorns of Love can actually remove what I think is the biggest issue for them in the early game, which is disrespecting when enemies out of vision. If they've worked on that, and maybe they haven't, as Kelsey's saying, but if they have, and actually calling saying, hey, enemy support and jungler have not been seen on the map for 30 seconds. Be careful.
Or if he just plays the top side when he has no vision of bot at all.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, which is also something that he went.
So some of those issues. No, go ahead.
I'm just saying they also think that this is like part of their style, that they go for higher risk things like this in bot or without vision that other people wouldn't go for. They think that this is like also a positive part of how they play. So I don't necessarily think that will change either, but yes.
We'll see. I hope it will, because in this meta you don't even need to gamble in the early game. Like you can actually run comps which are safe in the early game, have good scaling, and you don't need to go for those all-ins. And again, as I said, if they've actually improved that communication part of not disrespecting when people are out of vision and could potentially go mid or go top, like Chachi's doing the same, where he just overextends without having any information of where the enemy is. If it's something they have been able to work on, it will improve the early game a lot. But again, it's been 3 weeks. It's actually impossible to say which team shows up.
Okay. I mean, to be fair, Unicorns of Love would have a pretty good mid laner right now if it wasn't for like Xpeke and his family telling Power of Evil that they'd pay him loads of money, basically. I want someone to make a meme. It's going to blend modern memes with old things that happened, of like Xpeke and his mom just like tapping the side of their heads, like, can offer people any salary you want if you never have to pay it. Just like, that's they cracked the game. I don't know why no one else thought of it first. Everyone else thought you had to honor those receipts. Right, so what about Fnatic then? So Fnatic was a team that obviously people were high on this season. I mean, the MVP of the league is in Fnatic. It's reckless there. Deficio, as usual, he thought, right, the old script, talk up Fnatic, they can do it. The back boys, the back to become the champions, the legacy. They obviously blew the semi-finals epically. Did well in the third place. What's taking both twos into account? You said they're your favourite to win the gauntlet. What were the good and the bad that we've learned of Fnatic based on the playoffs, Deficio?
The bad we have learned from them is they were super, super slow at actually realizing what was going wrong for them in playoffs and adapting to it. I think they had the wrong read as well on actually their own team, funny enough, going into the semi-final. I think Kelsey has had some really good articles on the whole issue as well with Fnatic that I really agree with. And one of them being that Broxa is a player who I think looked really good in the regular season. However, I probably overrated his actual impact. And when Soas was no longer on a champion that could engage, it would often fall on Broxa to be that guy, and being the only person who can engage on like a Gragas in the semifinal was horrible. Like, it was really, really bad. In almost every single team fight would be him playing, almost with his backline instead of actually being the guy who can engage with body slam flashes or disrupt the enemy carries, whatever it is. And it's something he's obviously aware of, because in the third place game, he actually did it much better. His Gragas was like way better in the actual third place game when he played more aggressive. So that was like one of the things where I think it took them too long in the Misfit series to realize that they were not getting Jarvan, they were not getting Gnar, and they needed Jessis to play engage as well to help Broxa. So third game was the first game where they stopped banning Rakan and actually picked it, and he was really good on it, and it helped them a ton. The fact that they had him and Broxa playing as frontline engages, and then obviously they also did better in the early game, funny enough. The fourth game, he didn't play as Alistar, and he doesn't play Alistar well, like at all. He played it really poorly. Clearly, it seemed like a pick he wasn't comfortable on. That was something they worked on for the third place game, and he was much better on Alistar. So the bad was they had the wrong read on their own team, in my opinion, of how they actually should draft in their semifinal, and they didn't understand mid priority, like gank mid. It's really helpful. Third place game, I did see some of those things get fixed, as Veteran said as well, and that's why I have them actually as my favorites in Gauntlet, because I think they started to fix some of those problems.
I'm still a little conservative about Fnatic, because I think that they were to an extent aware of their problems before. Like, they were aware that they have an issue with, because I talked to Soaz even as far back as Rift Rivals, where he was aware that if you are constantly looking to get pick and sideline and you lose mid, it's to a team that scales better or whatever, it's a problem. So I felt like they were aware of these problems. They just had a really hard time fixing them. And so you do see games where they're playing much stronger mid jungle duo to an extent, and they're getting priority mid, and you saw some of those games in the regular season. And that's why I think for me it was like hindsight is 2020 almost, writing that article, because there were signs that, okay, we're aware, we're trying to fix these issues. So I think to an extent it's just what game it happens to be, whether Fnatic can set up these plays around. And I think it has a lot to do with whether or not, like, Broxa is almost more comfortable ganking a losing mid matchup, I think, because he doesn't dive necessarily that well. I also think he's really conservative about his ability to take advantage of pressure. He doesn't really play to bot side very well. It's a lot to do with playing to top side, and then when, like, Misfits played really well against Fnatic, I think, because of the fact that he doesn't abuse losing when the enemy team has losing mid jungle matchup. Like, they played Zac and Syndra, I think, against Cassiopeia Gragas, and then he was never really doing anything to really pressure Maxlor. Like, I think he did one invade topside the entire game, and from there, like, Maxlor could just scale as Zac and take advantage of the fact that Cassiopeia was overextending. So I think that for me, this is a big issue with Broxa, and it was showing up to an extent, especially in the first and some of the other games of the Fnatic H2K series. So I think that this is still a problem, but they did, in some situations, like, play to mid gank when, for example, H2K had a mid laner overextending. He was more comfortable ganking that, and there were moments where he would play bot side, but it's kind of off and on. I still do favor them over Splice, but I think that Splice in particular have a lot of separate issues that I think Fnatic can take advantage of later in the game.
So, okay,
sure.
Come on, Veteran.
Yeah, so while I did say that, like, between game 1 and game 2, like in the Fnatic HK series, the nice and day for Broxa, he still did show some of the tendencies that Kelsey just said. Like, he did prioritize the gank on mid when mid was losing. He's much more comfortable doing that than he has ever been diving anything. I agree with that. It's like the opposite way you would typically want to play in the jungle in LCS, and that added to the fact that, like, actually just before that as well, he responded to Sejuani and the pressure top attempting to take his Krugs by going to defend his Krugs instead of just trading Krugs really freely. Like, he's not a guy who seems to be experienced or has been taught to a large extent the proper way to play jungle in the LCS. So he still presented a lot of that. He just actually did prioritize mid. So I do not think by any means, like Deficio thinks maybe I'm just overdoing it a bit here, that Fnatic are about to like solve all of their issues going into the gauntlet. And Splice do have their own set of issues. Like, I think that they play far too much to Wonder's side of the map in mid-late game and give up Baron control a lot for that. I think that was costing them versus G2. But they're doing this because they're trying to make picks with very pick-oriented compositions, and they're figuring, oh well, G2 are obviously going to try to defend this push that Wonder has going bot, so maybe we're able to make a pick on them when they're transitioning through jungle, and they'll set up in jungle for that, and all G2 are doing is they push out top, and then they'll just take Baron control of that, because they don't really give a shit about what Wonder's doing if they're ceding Baron control for it. So
okay, so I've now fully accepted. I've now embraced it in Deficio. It's just my new worldview. Okay, I understand now that it's impossible to actually host this show. Like, you can't have any topic which we can talk about and go in any depth on, because everyone's just going to talk about everything to do with those teams, and then when they not mention another team, they'll just start talking about that team, and people will chime in, and eventually we can never talk about regionals because we've already quarter talked about regionals, and then quarter talked about it some more at the same time as talking about all the matches while not talking about all the matches. So I'm just going to direct the topic at this point in time. I'm going to ask you this again. While still talking about Fnatic, you know that team about 10 minutes ago some of you were talking about? While talking about Fnatic, this is a team that all 5 players were voted all LCS. So we had Soaz, Broxah and Reckless were in the All-Pro first team. We had Caps was in the All-Pro second team, and then Jezis was in the All-Pro third team. So on paper, in theory, the best team in the regular split. They had all these players voted so highly, right? To narrow in on one of them, do you think that this means that Broxah in the regular split really was the best jungler, and that in the playoffs, do you think it was it inexperienced? Did he choke? How would you rationalize what happened in the spring split and then what happened in the playoffs, Deficio?
I think a big one for Broxah specifically was that very few teams in the regular season actually figured out if they could expose him or not, or how to do it, because on this Fnatic lineup, and I think the main reason that actually every coach and every team voted Broxah in top 3, and most of the Fnatic players in the top 3 in every single role. Sorry? You didn't.
I just said nice save.
I'm just adding that in. Is that one of the main strength of Fnatic, in my opinion at least, is the individual talent on the lineup, especially during the regular season, where Broxah, as an example, would be able to play either Elise and Lee Sin the first half, or then like Gragas, Sejuani, Zac in the second half, and actually look good on these individual champions mechanically. So when you combine Soaz and Broxah as an example, you have a really strong 2v2 in terms of just the raw talent on both players. And they would use that to win a lot of skirmishes or execute a lot of ganks that would then get Soaz ahead, and then he would go bot lane, and then he would do the same for Jezis and Reckless, and then they would get ahead, and then suddenly they had like 3 winning lanes after that. And I think that happened in so many regular season games, and it was so rarely actually exposed because most teams could not just run over Fnatic in the early game and like invade Broxah, try and abuse him. And very few teams, funny enough, in Europe also just hard camped mid lane during the regular season, which proved during Rift Rivals and as we saw against Misfits to be one of the counters to Fnatic strategy. So because that rarely happened, all these Fnatic players looked super good individually, Broxah being definitely one of them. And I think this entire story of how because Gilia said this on the analyst desk as well, like this story of, oh, Fnatic just have winning lanes every game, so it's too easy to be a jungler. I never bought into that at all. I saw Soaz not having winning matchups really often. I saw the bot lane not straight up dumpster the lane 2v2 as well, and just get ahead with like 4 to 5 CS maybe, but not even have like a lane where they're completely dominating. And then it was typically Broxah's gank that would actually set them ahead. So sure, you can obviously say that Broxah had an easy time because he had really good players around him, but I also think he did a lot of work in the early game getting these lanes ahead, like for real, And then the one thing people never talk about with Broxah in the regular season is that he was actually really good in team fights on these tanks. And he was really good in team fights on Lee Sin as well. So Fnatic was able to win in the late game, even against teams like G2, where Broxah was one of the guys who actually did well, which is why I was so sad in the semifinal to watch his teamfight performance there. Whatever reason that is, he got exposed, he couldn't perform under pressure, I don't know, but he just looked so much worse in that semifinal. Probably also because Maxlow was just the better jungler. But in the third place game, I did not feel like Jankos out-jungled Broxah in the third place series completely. I actually felt like Broxah had a lot of impact in a lot of games. So maybe I overhyped him a little bit, but then I also think other people are underrating him at the same time. And he's doing his job in most of the games on Fnatic without being the big carry.
See, I just think his pathing is really weak in general. He basically has he's able to do first full clear in many games just because his lanes have control on their own. And if you look at the fact that his side lanes are consistently ahead, and I think he plays to top side much more than bot. And the way that Justice and Reckless like to play the lane is that they will get winning 2v2 matchup. And the reason why they went for Varus and Ashe wasn't because they wanted the Reckless on an engage pick or they wanted this type of team fighting ability. It was because they wanted a strong AD carry in lane. And they were very open about this. So when they went away from the Kennen, who also obviously is a strong AD carry in lane, they wanted an AD carry that can still like control the wave, can still stack the wave, because then the enemy jungler can't ever dive them, right? If you have a big enough wave built up, it's really hard to dive. And as long as you can control the lane and you can do that, your bot lane is really safe. And then off of that, Justice would often like ward the enemy blue buff or whatever, but they would never make a play or do anything off of that. And I felt like, well, never is a bit strong, but it was pretty rare. As many times as Fnatic's bot lane were able to do it, I felt like Fnatic as a team like never took advantage of this type of thing super well. And Broxah was much more likely to go for advantages on top side. Fnatic also, because they didn't very often have deep vision, because I felt like Broxah, like when, in my opinion, okay, first is the ideal way to play the game. If you have winning lanes and your lanes are strong, is you just invade and you deny enemy jungle, because this is like a very easy way to win your matchup, a very easy to take advantage of the fact that your team is really good. And I felt like he wasn't really comfortable doing that. He would do a full clear, maybe gank top. He would occasionally gank mid as well, I think. But then, like, when the enemy jungle was never really pressured against when Broxah played. So that was my big problem with him, and why I didn't have him on any of my all-pro teams.
I mean, I actually agree 100% with the point of him being weak when it comes to punishing enemy junglers. But for Fnatic specifically, my hardest thing is I don't know actually if this was the actual game plan to say, hey, Broxah, you're new, you're young. Your main goal in the early game is to get your farm, and then whenever we call for you to come to a lane and gank, you come to that lane and gank. And that probably happened during the start of it, which actually is why he maybe never developed his own like pathing or style, or improved at that part, which is something that actually did get exposed here. So that was kind of one of my regrets was looking at my all-pro votes specifically with the jungle is I think putting Jankos first would have been better. I think in hindsight with playoffs, putting Maxlow up there would also have been more valuable, but not hard to do during the regular season. Like, I was missing a standout jungler who I felt like had consistently been better than the other junglers for my all-pro votes, which is why I looked at Broxah and I was like, consistency, it's there. Like, almost every single game, he's able to like get one of his lanes ahead. He's always doing well in terms of team fighting the late game, and he never really falls behind on his own. So I'm like, those are all three super good things as a jungler, and he's not a liability for Fnatic in that case. But obviously, against the better competition in playoffs, we did see some of those problems with him not actually taking advantage of big leads for himself or his team to shut down the enemy jungler. And I agree 100% with that. And that's why, in hindsight, I don't think he's the best jungler in Europe. I think he had a good regular season. And I don't think there was a lot of other junglers who actually had complete standout regular seasons in EU LCS, which made that position super hard to actually rate who is by far the best and who is second, who is third.
Veteran, Kelsey didn't have him all-pro at all. Deficio had him number 1. What is your take on Broxah? Spring split, summer split, and now you've seen him in the playoffs.
Sure. So the big thing... Okay, how much can I even bring up about playoffs now about diverting the subject? So the
you
big
can
thing
divert
about
the subject,
Broxah,
just don't then make 7 diversions off that and then keep going, within reason. Keep it within reason.
He had said that Fnatic would be splicing goal now, so I went on a main tangent about splice.
Okay.
But when it comes to Broxah, I think that Kelsey's idea that the enemy jungler never really feels threatened by Broxah is like a really big reason why junglers like Gilius are looking at Broxah and thinking, well, it's actually easy to play a jungle with like winning lanes. They're not just thinking it's easy to play a jungle with winning lanes. They're thinking, I would be living in the enemy's jungle right now if I was Broxah. And Broxah isn't. Broxah's just going for his like 4 full clear in a row. And I think that's the big criticism that a lot of junglers, and certainly a criticism that I have had of Broxah. I also think even his early clears just seems very, very strange a lot of the time. Again, the game 1 clear, he went for like 2 races before he even went back once, and that gives a better jungler like Yanko so much breathing room to do whatever the hell he wants to do in the game. And I think Maxwell and Yanko should be above him. I think Yanko's would be first for me, at least. I think Maxwell's developed a lot. Can I go on tangent about Maxwell? Yeah. So I think Maxwell's developed a lot over the course of the split. I think he went to a lot of top priority of Alphari, which is basically how he used to play with Alphari when he played in a UK scene with him. And but he's recently realized that mid priority is like the way to go in playoffs specifically. That's the big thing about Misfits. They now play through mid outright. I don't think Maxwell's that efficient though. I think that in the G2 series that was costing them a bit. Like Power of Evil was certainly safe and was certainly able to push out, and Trick wasn't necessarily abusing the matchup properly. But Maxwell was always there to sort of like he became Power of Evil's dog in the final playoff series, but he fell behind in levels pretty significantly, and that cost them later on. Like I think he over tunnels on like vision and on keeping his lane safe, and he always wants to be helping.
Wait one second.
That's basically my thought. Someone can expand that.
Okay. By the way, it's not a diversion if you talk about other players at the LCS All-Pro level. That is literally within the context of the conversation. Don't just go, and then that reminds me of another team.
You asked me about Broxah. That's why I asked. You asked me about Broxah.
To contrast is absolutely fine.
I mean, I generally think, like, looking at just playoffs. Oh, you're not done, Veteran?
Yeah, well, actually I have to say, prior to playoffs, it would be Yanko stand out first. After playoffs, Maxwell is, like, definitely up there, but I still wouldn't put him as, like, first.
Okay.
I think after playoffs, you put Yanko's, Maxwell, Trick in your top 3, and then you can debate the order back and forth after playoffs.
Debating about Trick still, in my head.
What's the problem with Trick?
I mean, the problem with Trick is the same problem that Trick has always had. I just don't think Misfits drafted good enough lanes to abuse Trick's issue. Like Trick very much ignores how his lanes are doing in terms of how he should be setting up the map for them, whereas Maxwell like overcommits to that. Maxwell goes for like an insane amount of deep vision topside and shallow wards on the bottom side every time he can. He'll like back permanently to do this, whereas Trick will just continue on farming. So while Maxwell is babysitting Power of Evil and getting vision everywhere that he can, Trick is getting like 1 or 2 levels ahead. And I feel like if Misfits had drafted lanes that had a lot more kill pressure than they did in like the first and second games, then I feel like Trick would have been abused a lot more, and I think it cost them in the third game somewhat. That's why Trick looked a lot better in playoffs, but I'm wondering how much of that is to do with Trick improving, or how much it was that his flaws just haven't been abused as much in playoffs.
I think Trick in particular. Trick and G2 would be good against the way Misfits want to play, because Misfits have had trouble getting priority mid a lot, and they've even been willing to kind of give up waves mid for Power of Evil to go to sideline and things like this. So the fact that Trick just he might do a full clear and back, or he might do a full clear and gank mid, and he ganks mid like quite a bit, and G2 are very focused and very practiced at doing this is good. I think Trick historically has kind of hasn't, and I think the way that you said it was good, where his lanes doesn't see how his lanes are setting up for him. I think that Trick historically has been like prioritizing getting ahead himself, which is good for if you want to play skirmishes, which is why I think they had 2016 spring was probably super successful for them, because Trick would get ahead and then they would take these surprising skirmishes, and even if their macro was nowhere near as good as it is now.
Trick took a lot of vision mid back then as well, though, which is a bit different.
It was really successful. And then I think that in general, it's kind of like if Trick feels like it, almost, he'll gank. Whereas, I guess with Misfits, if Misfits feel like it, if Misfits lanes feel like it, then Maxler, I'm sorry, you can't do this camp now.
But let me just ask real quick here. Should Trick do something different with the current G2 in Europe than actually play that style you just highlighted, where he focuses a lot on himself and only ganks if he really wants to, if it's really necessary? Like, isn't he technically then playing it the correct way, at least in Europe? Or what do you think?
I think that if Trick can fix a few things, like I think in one of the games he had a really good moment where he went and he pushed out the wave when it was going to bounce. But a lot of times he'll just go and he'll take the mid wave, even when the mid wave is like good for Perks, when Perks respawns. And that can sometimes make it so that Perks has to overextend and gets caught out more. I think that there are situations where the team might have advantage in a lane and he's not like counter jungling as effectively, or he doesn't necessarily know what to do with the downtime. Like, I think he's fixed this a lot more over time, is that I feel like a little bit when the jungle change and you do a full clear and suddenly you have downtime, like Trick didn't necessarily know how to convert that downtime effectively or what to do with it to get when he had tempo advantage as a jungler that way. So for me, I think that there are small things that Trick can fix as a jungler that suggest again that G2 as a team don't necessarily play super well with their jungler, or Europe as a region don't necessarily play super well with the jungler. And I think G2 are almost kind of like at the forefront of this, because it feels a lot like teams are sort of saying, okay, top and jungle take care of top side, support mid take care of bottom side, and then you have Trick. You have really good times where support and jungle can back or something, and then Trick, Mithy might say, we should make a play on Dragon and set up for Dragon here, and Trick's like, no, I need to clear top camps or something like this. I think that there's like this kind of disconnect for Trick, which was why I had difficulty with him. But I do think that like in playoffs, he was much better about when he needs to go mid, and he did much more effective in terms of like counter jungling around top side specifically. So I think that in playoffs, I would consider him. In regular season, I had Broxa, Xerxes, Maxlor, and I'm ready to justify Xerxes if necessary. But yeah.
Okay, so I've got a question. Keep going.
I think
everyone just continue. Keep going.
Okay, I think that even when it comes to playing around mid, though, in playoffs, Trick still had a lot to work on. Like there was a key instance in game 1 where Maxlor did his thing, shoved out Power of Evil's lane, and Power of Evil's going to back, and then Trick pops up and PoE cancels his back and harasses him a little. And then backs, but this gave Perks enough time to get back control of the lane, making the initial push like worthless. And I feel like if Jankos was Trick, Jankos would have made a play around that, and Orianna would be dead or no sums. I can't remember if Orianna had sums at that point. Immediately, on the next push, but that didn't happen. So I think that even if he's working on this, I think it's still far from perfect.
I just think so many things with Trick, and one of the reasons I think, obviously he was super good in playoffs and said that in playoffs he would be one of the top 3 guys, is like G2 as a team, a lot of what they do in the early game is not based on what one guy wants to do. It is like, what is the actual game plan they have in the early game? Take the whole Trick goes mid, and maybe messes up Perks' wave. Like, that doesn't happen. If he's going mid, 9 out of 10 times, it's Perkz communicating with Trick saying,
yes,
hey, do something mid, whatever it is, push out the wave, hold the wave, whatever. Trick's main job, and this was from talking to him specifically as well in playoffs, is like, make sure mid is winning. It doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter if you have to sacrifice yourself. Make sure that when Perkz is recalling or when he wants to recall and Perkz says, hey, Trick, come mid, you go mid. And you help him push out, and Perkz gets a good recall off. If there's a wave that needs to get pushed out because it's frozen and Perkz is back in base, Trick is in there doing that as well. And he picked up, like he's always done a little bit of this during the summer split, but it was something they focused a lot on very clearly during playoffs, was set Perkz up to success with Trick. And that's clearly a game plan made as the team and not about Trick individually. Yeah. And another thing also is, if you are G2 against Misfits, did you need to go for the all-in ganks with Trick in the early game, like the one you said that Jankos could have done? Not really. You knew your late game was better, because where Misfits struggled the most was in mid to late game when it came to executing Baron. So G2 were obviously playing super like risk averse, or like just don't gamble in the early game. And a lot of that comes down to Trick just saying, okay, value farm and safe vision control and like push out lanes / counter ganks more than all-in ganks yourself. And I think it was the correct strategy from G2, which is also why some of our finals games were like 0-0, 20 minutes in, because G2 literally didn't have to force anything in the early game. They knew they didn't have to. And Trick is a smart jungler. He plays tanks really well, so the meta benefits him a lot, and he fit the G2 style very well during playoffs. He might get abused at Worlds against Kasa and these kind of junglers.
Yes.
But not in Europe. Not in Europe.
I get that it's their strategy. It still would have been a really good thing if they had made that play. LeBlanc versus triple tanks, I know from experience, absolutely needs to be snowballed early on if you can. So he doesn't just need to be securing within this matchup. He should be looking out for things like that. I feel like the meta right now really does favor you going this whole safe bot, like a decent top, but still a top that is going to be really useful in team fights, and going for the scaling. I think the meta right now really favors that. But when the meta doesn't favor that, you're going to end up with situations like G2 versus Flash Wolves at IAM. That's what's going to happen. Like, I really hope that the meta holds as it is for Worlds. Otherwise, it will be an abusable point of G2.
That's why also, sorry.
Go on.
No, I'm just saying I agree with you. I think I really hope that G2 also realizes this. It was just going against Misfits. I think they just knew that all Trick had to do was like hold waves in the early game, don't go too over aggressive, and they will be fine. Hopefully they can also actually adapt and play more aggressive early game junglers. That is just sadly where he's actually been fairly weak during 2017. Yeah. Which could be a big issue for G2 on the international stage.
Evidently Trick was good enough to beat Misfits. I feel like Maxtor on G2 would also have been good enough to beat Misfits. That's the thing.
Agree.
And I think Jankos on G2 would have like stomped Misfits even faster.
And so, I think again, a lot of the stuff with G2 and Trick is like you say, there are these decisions made that are team made, and but I think these are decisions that are made that are team based are related to the fact that they understand what Trick will do and what Trick is going to do. And like, you're not going to make a decision for your team that's based on a jungler you don't have. And so this idea of like, he's never going to mess up the wave, like in general, G2 have a history of sacrificing some waves for mid, for jungle in general. And it might make it harder for Perkz to play mid. And even if like they necessarily say that, okay, our job is just to make sure mid is hard winning. And I do think that they say that because I've talked to them as well, and they take obvious steps to do that. But there are like instances where this doesn't go super well, or maybe Trick is too eager to go for a play mid. And in instances like this happened, I think a couple of times in the regular season where he goes for a level 2 gank and it's not a strong enough mid matchup, or he misses his CC when he goes for a gank. And then so like this happened a lot in the H2K series, and the lane ends up being at a standstill and he ends up wasting time, Perkz ends up wasting time. So there are moments where I think Trick is being well-intentioned to do the right thing, and the team obviously has made the decision, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like Trick is a good jungler because of it, if that makes sense.
The level 2 gank is like the Trick special, and I also feel like this is a rather sweeping statement, but it's very characteristic of junglers that like to have permission to farm for a little bit more after this. And Trick very much would go until like level 6 in his initial splits without ganking again if he did the level 2 Trick special. So
the only G2 players who made the first 2 All-Pro teams was Mithy was first team, and then Sven was second team, and then Perks and Tricks were in the third team. What were the big broad strokes as to why G2 was underwhelming, or at least undervalued in the in the regular season, and then were champions again of Europe? Like, is it the fact that so many of these other teams we're talking about who populated the All-Pro lists essentially, presumably played worse, didn't live up to expectations? Did the whole G2 team improve in some particular sense for the playoffs?
I think meta strongly favoured G2 for playoffs. I think the meta's slowly been tending to a place that G2 really like for a while. And I think that, well, as I was iterating before, that playing with like a safe bot lane and like a strong scaling mid laner, and all of these types of scaling factors are the type of thing G2 has been doing since Kingdom Come anyway. It just happens to be a really nice way to play the game right now. And in response to why H2K and Fnatic seem to be dominating the first 2 All-Pro teams, well, they had better records, I'm assuming, is why.
I disagree with you on G2. Sure. I obviously not their tendency, but I think early on in the split, they were playing a lot of stuff that was, they were trying to learn 1-3-1 effectively.
Yes, they were. I think that's bad for them.
And they very clearly had a lot of difficulty with it, and people were getting caught out. I think that Riot and everyone who voted and everything else made a pretty good decision by being conservative and putting G2 players in top 3 All-Pro, because if you're talking about overall consistency, like I assume that was a factor. Deficio, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, 100 for me at least. Consistency was very important. Oh, I thought you had more. Sorry.
Oh no, I was trying to hand it off to you because I feel like the general. I feel like you have a little bit more insight into why more people didn't put G2 in the
Just as a note, in the human world of social interaction, like the phrase "correct me if I'm wrong" sort of means like only correct me if you want to say I'm wrong. Like you're meant to continue at that point in time.
We already know
we've solved that. Yeah, I know. That's why I'm giving you the translation. We solved that problem. You make a mental note of that in your algorithm for next time. So, okay, what were you going to say, Veteran?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what I was saying previously, like, yeah, my point is that they had to play like this 1-3-1 style early on, and I don't think that suits them at all. And I think the meta has been slowly favoring them, and that's why they are doing better now than they were before. I'm not necessarily saying that therefore G2 should be all on the top of all of the All-Pro teams. I think the reason that they weren't at the top of the All-Pro teams is because they just weren't at the top of Europe, and this is why they weren't at the top of Europe. They had to practice a meta that doesn't favor them.
What do you think this means going forward, though? Because we know G2 is going to be at Worlds. We've seen the bad of them. We've seen the good. What does this say for projections for them going into Worlds?
Worlds meta doesn't change too much compared to playoffs and Gauntlet this time, it's looking like. So I actually think, God's willing, that they get out of groups this time with not much of an issue. It seems to be in a really good spot for G2 right now. So they will be in the knockout stage. Thank God. If I'm right, I will bet $100 with you about that if you would like I did with Monty, and I won that time too. So, like,
let's see the group draw first, because
I didn't even see Evolving qualified for Worlds last time. I'm not waiting for a group draw like a pussy.
I'm just saying, there's a world where they get like SKT in their group, and just let's just put in Immortals as well, and let's put in. What's
the problem? What's the problem so far, Deficio? You don't believe in Europe?
Hey, I mean,
good question.
In best of ones, I still do not believe in G2.
Oh, he's been burned. You sound cagey right now, Deficio. You sound like you're scared, What's going on?
Sven had an interview recently where he said he's worried about best of ones as well. I do think best of ones is a really unfair format for these types of stages. So
it's just, they always say that they're worried about best of ones,
The thing about G2 is, and this is something Youngbuck also talks a lot about, and Mithy as well, is like they're really good at playing against something, especially on stage. And if it's something that seems really good, they go back and they go like, okay, this pick was really good, or this style, we're going to start doing the same now. Give us a bit of time, we're going to practice it, and then we're really good at it too, and we're now going to play it. Best of ones do not allow you to like really lose a lot of games based on being surprised about what is happening in the meta. So I actually really agree with Veteran's point about the whole metas might stay roughly the same is super good for G2.
Yes.
I just still wonder if there will be some teams who come in and, like, right now we have different priorities on certain things, like NA's values, like scaling hyper carries really highly, at least like things like Cogmore and so on. We even see some of that in LPL, and I wonder if there's something there that could be a surprise for G2, but luckily they have like 3 weeks of boot camp, so I also pray that they will not get surprised in a best of one, because the meta seems pretty figured out in many ways, and that should be super good for them. But before I've seen the group draw, and Team WE is going to be 3rd seed, right?
Yes.
Because they have to go play-ins. So let's just pretend, you have SKT, Immortals, Team WE, and G2. Then I'm not 100% convinced that it's going to walk out of that group.
Okay. I think Immortals.
Yeah, SKT's not first.
I think Immortals would lose to G2. So hopefully. Even in that scenario, I think Immortals do a lot of the same stuff that Misfits do in certain regards, where they, like, G2 are really good at playing this, like, kind of push the wave, get the vision, make the play, push, like, this very, like, formulaic sort of, this is how you play it, this is how you set it up. Whereas you look at the Misfits G2 games, and there were a lot of gaps in when they wanted to go for something, but they didn't take, like, the necessary steps. They didn't push out the top wave. They didn't have this particular... They didn't have the river control here before they pushed out mid. Anything like this, that G2 tend to make these types of mistakes much less. Immortals also, they tend to greed for a lot of stuff. Like their bot lane in particular, really, really hard greeds for a lot of things, even when their jungler is top. They'll do these risky engages that I think G2 should naturally take advantage of. So I think that, yeah, for me, Immortals is not a team that I'd be that worried about for G2. The reason why I can confidently say that, even after Rift Rivals, and all this other stuff, and going into Rift Rivals, I actually thought Immortals was the best Western team at the time, is because in spring, G2, okay, were super good, okay? G2 were an insanely good team, and the rest of Europe was And then you get to summer, G2 are struggling, and everyone's like, oh, that's just because Europe is more competitive in general. No, that's really not why. Like, G2 are legitimately struggling at that point. And I think that because of that, with G2 on an upswing now, and they're looking to be like this kind of pseudo gap between G2 and the rest of the European teams again, I feel like you can feel confident that G2 have these types of macro play down enough to bet on them to do better than most of the 2nd tier teams or the 3rd tier teams going into the tournament.
I would love to see where all of these voices came from, by the way, because every time I check like Reddit or Twitter or something, they're just saying, well, yeah, but that's because the entirety of Europe is shit now, and we know that from Rift Rivals. So
yeah, Rift Rivals definitely changed people's opinions.
Yeah.
Real quickly.
Yeah.
What voices are you asking about?
he just means who they are. Anyway, right? It's
yeah.
So, okay, here's a question for you. Is most people probably didn't even have Misfits in any kind of position where they would have basically, everyone thought at best case scenario they'd be in the gauntlet. That's it. Like, they lost most games in the regular season. Misfits is going to Worlds. Now, while that's cool, and for some of them this is an awesome holiday, what will actually happen when Misfits goes to Worlds without knowing the group's veteran? What's a reasonable expectation in your book? Do they just go like, oh, great job in the season, you get shit stomped at Worlds, like, here's some experience, maybe, hope you make it back?
Oh, yeah, where do Misfits end up? I actually think Misfits have a good shot at getting out of groups. Okay, I'm not allowed to name theoretical groups, I guess, where they get out, but like one where it's like NA 3rd and Korea 1st, they come out 2nd, like really comfortably, in my opinion. I think the reason that everybody didn't think so much about Misfits coming into it is that Misfits essentially changed up their playstyle and their draft priority and figured out quite a few things coming into playoffs. And I think the Misfits that we just saw doesn't get destroyed by whatever break they're about to take before they go bootcamp in Korea for Worlds. I actually think they have a good chance of making out of groups. But that being said, I'm always going to be biased towards more European teams. I don't think that they like fluked it through playoffs or something. I think that there are visible changes to their playstyle now that are very beneficial and have shown actual growth from the team. I'm be more confident about them than Fnatic, so it's good for me that Fnatic are going into the gauntlet. Even though initially I thought, even though I never tweeted what I thought, I was completely wrong because I thought that it would be G2 Fnatic and HUK would be Misfits in gauntlet. So.
Oh, you got there's a safety on that trigger now. Is there? What happened with that? Once you start making money, you have to be careful what you tweet. What's going on here, veteran?
I just forget to tweet these days, actually.
Oh, what a shame that was. It's always on the stuff that would it completely wrecked you. Well,
Okay, when it's like content. Hey, I'm saying it now. But when my job was content, obviously I was on Twitter 24/7 because that was a huge deal.
Okay, fair enough.
So, to your Misfits question. I think they will actually benefit so much from Worlds and the bootcamp that I actually think they're going to come in super prepared and be a stronger team than people expect. I think a lot of people don't actually fully understand how big and good of a supportive staff they have around them, which I also think is one of the reasons they did so well in playoffs, because they were super good at actually analyzing what the weaknesses was of the teams they played against, being it Unicorns or Fnatic. Obviously, G2, they were kind of outmatched, and it was hard for them to do much more than what they did. But I have so much respect for their coach, Hussein. I think the Hiva, as well as the assistant coach, is super smart, and especially when it comes to pick and ban phases, it's where he's doing a lot of work, and the analyst Empire as well. It's a really, really good setup. They have a sports psychologist that works with them full time as well, who I assume will go with them to boot camp, and they have a very, very nice professional coaching staff with some players like Maxlor, who's super smart and one of the main shot callers in game. I think they're actually able to analyze the scrims when they get completely dumpstered if they get to play Korean teams, and really take advantage of that and learn from it more than most other European teams would. So I think they will learn more than basically any team in the gauntlet will learn going to Worlds. So I'm actually really happy they're the ones going. And I wouldn't have said this obviously 3 weeks ago because we hadn't really seen the playoff effect. But now, judging from how well they prepared for this, I'm super happy they're the ones going. And I think they have a better chance of getting out of groups than any of the remaining European teams.
So I kind of took it as a given that after HUK didn't make it to semifinals last split, that they wouldn't be going to Worlds because they wouldn't be in a situation where they could let someone, win and give them qualify for them, right? Which happened in the last two splits. So, but because of that, I was just kind of sad because I felt like there weren't really teams that really understood the jungle meta or anything like this. And I feel like now Misfits is a team that does. They understand how to play around jungle, the strength of their lanes, and when they get good drafts, which in the G2 Misfit series, I felt like the first two games, their drafts were really terrible, then they can play to priority really well. I think something that clicked for Maxlor, you mentioned that he wasn't that efficient. I think he's become much more efficient in terms of when I invade the enemy jungle, I don't just have to put wards, I can actually also take camps, I don't have to fall super far behind all the time. So I think for me, that has been a really good thing for Misfits, and I'm not sure why or how it happened, but I do remember a moment when at the start of the split, they played this 1-3-1 comp, and it was terrible. It was awful. And their Corki kept going to sideline or something, kept going mid when it should have been sideline and everything else like this. But I asked them why they were playing this, and they said because we suck at it, basically. So I feel like very few teams in Europe really used the regular season well, really very few teams. So many teams were afraid to use regular season games. Fnatic, it was very important for them that they only lost one series the entire split. For Misfits, that was less important than making sure they understood how to play the game. And so I think that really shows.
Here is a question for you then. Kelsey, who was your summer LCS MVP?
Reckless.
Okay. Was it everyone in this chat? Presumably Deficio was yours.
I had Soaz first, Reckless second.
Soaz, okay, that's bold. Well, who did you have, veteran?
I never thought about it. Okay, let me think. I wasn't asked to vote. I was in Challenger Series, so I guess with playoffs into account, I have to say
no. Without the playoffs, obviously.
Without playoffs into account,
season, yeah.
Bloody hell. I may say so, as he had a lot more impact on Fnatic. I think positive impact than Reckless did, and he took up a lot more responsibility than Reckless did. And I think Reckless was still displaying a lot of the issues that were presenting issues in Fnatic that he didn't attempt to make up for in the same way as SOAS did. So I think I might agree with Deficio and say SOAS.
Right, let's discuss the SOAS part then first. Then, Deficio, why SOAS?
I think SOAS, when they played the Kennen style, it was basically him and Reckless and their coordination that was super key. It wasn't just Reckless' ability to go to a side lane and obviously look for the correct place. I think SOAS was almost flawless on things like Galio and Shen in knowing exactly when and how he should actually set up this kill with Reckless. And that was something I value very highly. And then when the meta shifted for Fnatic and they played more the Ashe, that kind of style, and SOAS started playing a lot of Gnar and a lot of Jarvan, I think he always did well in laning phase. He was the main engage for this team for the vast majority of the time. And the amount of pressure that's always put on SOAS also in the games by opposing teams, and the fact he's actually playing around that so well, just to me, just felt like he was the backbone of Fnatic more than any other player. Reckless obviously had a fantastic split as well, and I think it's perfectly fine he got the MVP. But to me, I think just Fnatic could not have done what they did in the second half of the split without SOAS. I think he was the main person there, and not necessarily Reckless when he was playing more the Ashe and these kind of AD carries. So that's why I gave it to SOAS.
So Kelsey, why was Reckless the MVP for you?
This is like such a weird alternate reality, because usually I'm arguing for like the top laner that gets ganked all the time, and people are like, no, but this really sick fucking carry, man. No. So I think for me, it's really hard to, obviously when you're counting intangibles, you'll give a lot more credit to SOAS because of the fact that he ended up being like kind of a mentor figure for a lot of the rookies. Allegedly, Reckless kind of hid himself from the team a lot. Allegedly, Reckless was like kind of tunnel visioning on playing this picks and had to be told not to play these picks. I think the reason why I ended up giving it to Reckless is because they found a style that worked for them in spring that helped this team get out of a place where they could have been playing relegation, and it put a lot of pressure on Reckless in particular. You have to get this lead. You have to be able to understand like when you can sideline and when you can't. You have to know when you can swap this effectively. Like Fnatic did a lot of lane swaps, and then he ended up with like a lot of the times when he was playing these engage or this Blade of the Ruin King, highly mobile ADs, he would be the one that would go with the support to roam, or when he was playing the Twitch, he would be the one who was making the play on the top side, doing the flank in this regard, and he was the one taking this type of initiative. With SOAS, obviously, there's a lot. It's like I really wanted to do an article, which was like Reckless or SOAS, and which player you would vote for, because I think that a lot of the arguments you can make for Reckless and a lot of the arguments you can make for SOAS, you can flip on their head and make them for the other player. So in that regard, to me, it was just really convincing because the team sort of became about Reckless having to be this carry because there was no one else almost that they could play around in this regard. And then with that transitioning into summer split, when Roxa is playing much more, I felt, to topside and mid, and Reckless was deterring dives by stacking waves and doing a lot of these things in some controlling the bottom half of the map with Jesses like on their own, I felt like overall, Reckless was the MVP for me. And just how much he improved also was a huge factor for me. Because as an individual player, like you don't see players who play for 5 years and then suddenly they're like their entire play style becomes like much more oppressive, much more lane oriented, much more like just kind of insane in all these different regards. And I felt like Reckless really made this transformation where he was putting pressure on people. So for me, like all of these factors made Reckless my MVP for the summer split.
Right, Veteran, what were you alluding to when you said like Reckless still had like the same issues or something? What's on your mind in that sense?
So Fnatic's a huge issue throughout summer and throughout the playoffs that really was biting them in the back was that they have a lot of priority on making plays on side lanes. It was really easy to do that with Kennen. It's still really easy to do that with stuff like Ashe and stuff like Xayah. But they would be doing that while utterly ignoring mid priority. almost entirely. So, for example, first game win Boxer against bot, he did that without checking whether mid had first push or not, and the game exploded because he didn't bother to check that. But I feel like Reckless is the one that is making these calls, because then later on in the game he would be extending topside and looking to make a pick on the side lane in really bizarre situations where he must know that they are looking to set up a play on him as well, and he's just left himself really exposed. And this is the type of issue that bit them in the back. And I think because Reckless exposes himself like this, if you were able to abuse Fnatic's group situation mid in any regards, I think that that Fnatic would just get rolled over. And I think Soaz, in finding a way, in finding a niche where he was able to pick dominant lane champions, but also champions that had really strong engage tools in mid, that he basically fixed that. And I don't think that Reckless could have been Reckless without Soaz figuring out how to be Soaz.
Okay. Because I actually thought in that interview that Reckless did after the third place game, like that was unreal, because Deficio, Reckless has been red-pilled about his own career. Like when he played in those Fnatic teams in the first LCS splits, like obviously season 4, season 5, in those different teams, which obviously were radically different, you know, one was the Expected Soaz team, then the other one was the Huni Reignover one. In these teams, one of the reasons why people think I'm like some mad Reckless hater who thinks he's a shit player, which has never been the case, by the way. I always thought he was a very good player, but I just didn't think he was like a full-on carry in the same sense that players like Forgiven, etc., is because when I look at those teams, the whole style of those teams is pretty much dictated by the players I was referring to there. Like they're the stars to me, and to me even the teams are set up that way. But everyone still used to, as a consensus, be like, no, Rix is the best AD carry. He even won MVPs in these seasons, you know. And what's amazing is in this interview, he basically legitimately, like, echoes kind of what I was putting forwards there, which is that he kind of says that I was kind of a background player in some of those past teams. He made it sound like, you know, this year was all about like acknowledging like I'm going to be not only a captain, but I'm going to be like the focal player in the team. I'm going to try and succeed that way, you know. I was amazed to hear this, because even though it's not like, by the way, just because a player says something that makes it the case, you know, players can say whatever they want, but it's very rare that you actually get a player who kind of, especially when they've had so much positive reinforcement by the community and success, who, as Kelsey says, you know, changes radically how they are as a player and even their role within the team. What did you think of that?
I mean, I think Reckless has matured so much ever since he joined the league, and I think he's gotten a lot better actually looking at himself and realizing maybe what he's doing wrong and what he's doing right. To your point regarding, like, you know, Reckless back in the day, I think the first bit when he joined, which is, if I remember correctly,
season 4, I think.
Season 4 summer or season 4 spring. It was spring. Yeah. Season 4 spring, where he got MVP as well. In one of those.
He actually got MVP in the summer one, but yes, he was very good still in this.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember in spring that he was not the utility AD carry who would sit back. He was the main carry of the team.
Yes, that was the one where they started out where like they didn't die in the bot lane for like 6 games or something.
Exactly, and he was like playing Vayne and that kind of stuff and just like hard carrying games. And because I remember it was my first year of casting, I was being like, holy shit, this guy's like insane. But then he became more of the utility AD carry with Huni Reignover, obviously in all of season 5. And I think maybe your argument was that some fans were remembering season 4 Spring Reckless, who is a massive carry, and he could like just win games on his own, and then maybe didn't notice the difference between season 4 and season 5 Reckless. Because season 5 he was very much don't lose lane, pick utility champions, and make sure that you are allowing Reignover to play topside at like all stages of the game.
I think season 4 summer Reckless was also a lot like this. My theory isn't that it was Huni Reignover. I think it had a lot to do with the way that the support meta changed. Because in season 4, when Soaz and Reckless were able to play like these really dominant 2v2 lanes in season 4 spring, that was fine. I think they started getting punished for not having enough like deep vision or vision coverage in season 4 summer. And so the way that they kind of compensated for this is that they had to have Yellowstar roam a lot more. So then Reckless like sort of became this kind of hug tower, sort of not make too outrageous plays. And the only time that really changed was when he was on Lucian. And everyone remembers like the sick Lucian game against LNQ after Fnatic were basically already out and Reckless was mad and everything like this. But it's like he was only really able to do that on Lucian, which was like an obscenely busted champion anyway. So I think for me that was like a shift in Reckless's mentality that happened really young. And it just became his playstyle for a really long time. So I'm still just like shocked by how he went completely the other way this year.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, keep going, Deficio.
Yeah, no, I was just
on
going to say
those
like,
solution games. Oh,
no,
go on.
please take it.
The plague is
even on
fucking
those
killing
solution
everyone
games.
listening to this and me. Keep going.
All right. So all I'm going to say is like, I just remember the season 4 spring Reckless, who was a carry. I didn't actually remember the season 4 summer, so I should have just kept it to spring for sure. Season 5, he for sure was utility based, 100%. Season 6 was where he already in season 6 tried to be the captain and more of a carry. That was like the entire story around Reckless being the guy who kind of was staying and picking his team as well, and everything, and that didn't succeed at all. So that was where, I mean, first of all, the lineup never seemed to really click with the Spirit Gamsu one they had, and Reckless at that time wasn't like a complete standout carry either, which is one of the reasons maybe it didn't succeed as much for him. But in season 7, especially in the summer split, I think he's been like a really strong carry, and like from winning lane to having like good team fights. So I definitely agree the transition is really awesome. I think season 6 was where he tried to become the big carry, but didn't succeed. And you either then can blame him for that, or you can blame the team, because he also had to play with like 3-4 different supports. It was like Noxiag, and then it was Cly, and then I think Yellowstar came back season 6 summer as well. Like it was a complete mess with Fnatic, and I don't think he was even set up to actually succeed, which now he's been with Jessis for a long time, and it definitely is something that benefits him, because Jessis very much is also trying to win lane super hard, which makes it easier for Reckless to do well in the early game. So the transition is super cool. I think it's cool that he's also looking back at it and saying that was how it used to be, and now I'm trying to do this more. And he often talks about how season 6 was a tough time for him.
Okay.
I think that actually the supports that he's had to play with have vastly influenced this transition. Like, I think that season 4 summer he was still king of last hits, but season 4 and season 5 when he was playing with Yellowstar actually isn't a very strong laner at all. And I think that Yellowstar had this very roam-centric style to compensate for his own deficiencies in that sense. And when Yellowstar came back from TSM, they actually didn't try to play that style with Yellowstar. They actually tried to play a more lane-centric style, and it just didn't work out. And I think that Reckless has taken up a lot more responsibility to himself in this regard because of that failure, because it can't just go back to how it always used to be, and he is going to have to step up at some point. And I think that when Yellowstar returned and that didn't work out because they tried to play in lane, and Reckless realized actually he knows how to do this better than a lot of people, better than even the people who had mentored him all the way through there. He should be the one to take responsibility now, and I think that's influenced a lot of his growth in that regard.
Okay, so what I want to know is, for the regionals, obviously, we don't know all the matches because we don't know who will literally win all the matches, and there's many different possible permutations. So I'll just go like this. So, Deficio, you alluded before that Fnatic will win it. What are the main reasons why Fnatic will win the gauntlet, and why? And who do you think will challenge them? Who will reach the final and play them?
I think I'm going to say Splyce will challenge them in the final. I think Fnatic will have the advantage. They've been watching Splyce play on the Friday, on the Saturday. I think the fact that Fnatic won in the 3rd place game and showed some improvement, definitely not. They didn't fix all the issues. To go back to a question like an hour ago from you, veteran. But I think generally, due to the fact they only have to prepare for one BO5, being able to watch the teams, having already shown some signs of like a bit more focus on mid, and I think they will actually come in and be the stronger team. It might not be a super easy road for them, but I think they will end up winning in the end.
Okay. Veteran, you've already teased us that Splyce is somehow going to come through super strong. Who do you have winning the gauntlet, and will Splyce be playing Fnatic in the final of the gauntlet?
If Fnatic... if Boxer gets some more help, Fnatic can win for sure. Otherwise, Splyce will win because Splyce are going against a lot of teams that will fall prey to this very pick-heavy style that they are playing right now. And I actually think that a lot of the macro issues that Splice showed against G2, where they are really tunneling on looking to make these picks and reading the enemy team wrong, I think that a lot of those are solvable in the time frame that they have had to prepare. And I generally think that unless Fnatic fix this one issue that they have, that's going to potentially hold them back, I think Fnatic will win if they do that. Otherwise, Splice are essentially going to be doing what they were doing when they beat us on H2K, which is that they are going to abuse a team that has suddenly lost their way, because they're going to be up against a lot of teams that are fairly worse than they should be right now.
Okay. Kelsey, who do you have?
I have Fnatic. I think it'll be Fnatic. I think that they've both made really good points, but the point that Deficio made about Fnatic having time to prepare and Splice having to play these series is relevant on the other side for Splice, because I think what Splice had going into the G2 series was a lot of really cute ideas. And by that I mean like the Camille, Morgana, and then they had this comp that was a team fight comp, that was a pick comp dressed up as this pick comp with Jhin and Sejuani and Jarvan. And so I think that these types of ideas were good, but in a lot of ways it felt like they were sort of running out of them, and they'll have to use a lot of them to get through these stages of the gauntlet, and people will be able to like identify and counter them. So I think that that's relevant. Another reason why I think that Fnatic will win is because Splice play a style that is very tunneled on like playing side lane as well. But I think that they tend to overforce in mid at really bad times. And this is a problem that Fnatic, like, I think they don't identify when the setup in mid lane is weak. I think that they're bad at identifying that, which is where Fnatic lose, is when people force on them when their setup in mid lane is weak. The other thing is that because they don't necessarily balance the map properly with Wonder side laning, Fnatic's normal style of we'll just 2v1 the guy on the side lane, I think will work really well for them without them even necessarily having to fix their problems. So that's why I think that Fnatic should win the gauntlet.
I think Wonder Trashy are much better than Soaz Boxer. I think Soaz is more important to his team, so that nobody calls me out on the fact I just gave Soaz MVP. I think Soaz has been much more important to the success of his team, but I think Wonder can go some way to neutralizing that if it comes down to Fnatic versus Splice.
So I was just tricking everyone before. This has actually been a very postmodern episode where I like to sort of keep, sort of like in Game of Thrones, they just hop between the storylines, That's what I was doing with this, I kept dodging around. So no, I kept everyone off guard, but then we brought back, we alluded to things before and then came back to visit other characters, often like Essos and stuff. So as a final point before the show ends, Veteran, would you like to tell us what you didn't say about Misfits that is very important to end the show with?
Oh, God. Yeah, I think that Deficio made a big point about the coaching staff of Misfits is going to help them to adapt, for sure. But I don't even think that Misfits had figured out some really simple things about the meta and about pick ban coming into the finals even. Like the Tristana Jarvan thing that also HGK had wrong. They had wrong in the finals as well, and they got severely punished for it in the first game, for example. And I think that a lot of these elements, I think Misfits coaching staff are going to be really tested. Because if they are going to lose at Worlds, it is going to be on their understanding of the meta, on their understanding of priority bans and priority picks. They could very well lose it in the draft. And I think that their coaching staff still needs more time to figure that out. And they're just not going to have the slew of foreign games that they would here, which G2 are so good with, to figure that out. I think that a lot of the success in terms of gameplay could also be attributed to Maxlore and Ignar, because it is very much around how they are playing the map. Like Misfits have had this really big transition from in spring they were playing around bot side of the map, like Hansama normally did with like Millennium, etc. But it was a lot to unlock Ignar. And I think in summer, for most of regular split, they were playing around top, but then in playoffs, Maxlore has made the transition to start playing around mid more, and Ignar with pressure will play around mid a lot more as well if he can. And they're opening up the map that way. And I think those two players are the big reason behind the change that has driven Misfits. I think that their coaching staff will be a very good asset to them. I do think Hussein is really good. and they've brought on Hiva recently, and I think Hiva has a really good understanding of matchups as well. But they did display in the finals that they have issues figuring out the current meta and keeping trends. When I said that they had figured out some things about meta, I meant that they want Tristana priority before anyone, but they didn't realize that if Tristana is banned on blue side, you have to remove Jarvan, or Jarvan is going to change so many mid matchups that it really doesn't matter if you just banned Cassio or not. Unless you're about to play Corki and they're prioritizing Orianna the whole time, you're going to get really abused. Like, they didn't seem to know that coming into the finals.